Thunderpoint by Jack Higgins. With Reichsleiter Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party, Chancellery and secretary to Adolf Hitler, the most powerful man in Germany after the Führer, actually escaped from the Führer bunker in Berlin in the early hours of May 2nd, 1945, has always been a matter of conjecture. Simon Wiesenthal, the greatest Nazi hunter of them all, insisted he was alive. And there was a Spaniard who had served in the German SS who insisted that Bormann left Norway in a U-boat bound for South America. Berlin, the Führer bunker, April the 30th, 1945. The city seemed to be on fire, a kind of hell on earth, the ground shaking as shells exploded. In the eastern half of Berlin, the Russians were already in control. Berlin was doomed. Everyone knew that, and the panic was dreadful to see. The Reich Chancellery itself was battered and defaced by the bombardment, but deep in the earth, protected by 30 meters of concrete, the Führer and his staff still worked on in a subterranean world, still in touch by radio with the outside world. At the rear of the Chancellery, the once lovely gardens were a wilderness of uprooted trees and the occasional shell hole. The man who walked on his own in the ruined gardens seemed curiously indifferent. He didn't even flinch when another shell landed on the far side of the Chancellery. He was not very tall, with heavy shoulders and a coarse face. Nobody of any importance, that would have been the conclusion. And yet this man was Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. The vast majority of the German people had never even heard of him, but he had organized his life that way, deliberately choosing to be an anonymous figure wielding his power from the shadows. An SS corporal came out of the bunker and hurried towards him. He gave the Nazi salute. "Herr Reichsleiter, the Führer is asking for you." "Good. I should come at once." When Bormann knocked on the study door and went in, the Führer was seated behind his desk, examining some maps. He glanced up. "Ah, Bormann, there you are. Come in. We don't have much time. They'll be here soon, the damned Russians. But they won't find me waiting. Stalin would like nothing better than to exhibit me in a cage." "That can never be, mein Führer." "Of course not. I shall commit suicide, and my wife will accompany me on that dark journey." He was referring to his mistress, Eva Braun, who he had finally married at midnight on the 28th. "But you, my old friend, you have work to do." Hitler shuffled around the table, the man who only 3 years previously had controlled Europe. Now his cheeks were sunken, and his hands shook with palsy. "Anything, mein Führer." "I knew I could depend on you." Hitler shuffled back to his chair. "The Kameradenwerk, action for comrades, that is your task, Bormann. To see National Socialism survives. We have hundreds of millions in Switzerland and elsewhere in numbered accounts. but you have the details. Yes, my Führer. Hitler reached under his desk and produced a rather strange-looking briefcase, dull silver in appearance. Bormann noted the Kriegsmarine insignia etched in the top right corner. Hitler flicked it open. The keys are inside along with a number of items which will prove useful. He held up a large file. I call this the Blue Book. It contains the names of many members of the British establishment, both in the ranks of the aristocracy and Parliament, who are friendly to our cause. A number of our American friends are there also. He passed an envelope across. The paper was almost like parchment. It had been written in English in July 1940 and was addressed to the Führer. The signature at the bottom was that of His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. He was agreeing to take over the throne of Great Britain in the event of a successful invasion. The Windsor Protocol, Hitler said simply. Can this be true? Bormann asked in astonishment. Himmler himself vouched for it. He had the Duke approached by his agents in Portugal at the time. Or said that he had, Bormann told himself. That devious little animal had always been capable of anything. He handed it to the Führer, who replaced it and the other items in the briefcase. This is standard issue to U-boat captains, completely self-sealing, water and fireproof. Yours now. One point, my Führer. How do I leave? We are now surrounded here. Quite simple. You will fly out using the East-West Avenue. As you know, Field Marshal Rütte von Greim got away in an Arade just after midnight yesterday. A young man, Captain Neumann, volunteered to fly in a Feisless Doch during the night. He arrived safely and is now waiting your orders. But where, my Führer? In that huge garage at Goebbels' house near the Brandenburg Gate. From there he will fly you to Rechlin and refuel for the flight to Bergen in Norway. From there you will proceed by submarine to South America, Venezuela, to be precise. You'll be expected. One stop on the way, but all the details are in here. He handed him an envelope. You'll also find my signed authorization giving you full powers and several false passports. So I leave tonight. No. You leave within the next hour, Hitler said calmly. Because of the driving rain and low clouds, there is no air cover at the moment. I have confidence you will succeed. Bormann nodded. Of course, my Führer. Then there only remains one more thing, Hitler said. You'll find someone in the bedroom. Bring him in. The man Bormann found in there wore the uniform of a lieutenant general in the SS. There was something familiar about him, and Bormann felt acutely uncomfortable. Note the resemblance, Bormann? Hitler asked. It was true. Bormann realized the general did have a look of him. Not perfect, but undeniably there. General Strasser will stay here in your place, Hitler said. In the confusion and darkness, it's hardly likely anyone will notice. You will now exchange uniforms. He took both of Bormann's hands in his. "I prefer to say goodbye now, old friend. We will not meet again." Cynical as he was by nature, Bormann felt incredibly moved. "I will succeed, mein Führer. My word on it." "I know you will." Hitler shuffled out. Precisely half an hour later, Bormann arrived at Goebbels' house. He carried a silenced Mauser pistol in one pocket. It was dark in the vast garage building. Lights were switched on, and Bormann found a young man standing by the wall, a pistol in his hand. A small Fieseler Storch plane stood in the center of the empty garage. "General Strasser?" Captain Neumann looked relieved and holstered his pistol. "Thank God." Neumann climbed up into the cabin and started the engine. "We'll taxi across the road to the Brandenburg Gate. From there we'll take off towards the Victory Column." There was broken glass and rubble in the street, and the Storch bumped its way along, passing many astonished refugees. The rain was driving down. Neumann said, "Here we go," and boosted power. The Storch roared down the center of the road, people fleeing before it, and suddenly they were airborne. Bormann was not even aware of any ground fire. "You must live right, Herr Reichsleiter," the young pilot said. Bormann turned to him sharply. "What did you call me?" "Oh, I'm sorry," Neumann said, "but I met you at an award ceremony once in Berlin." Bormann decided to leave it for the moment. "Don't worry about it." He looked down below as Berlin burned, and Neumann took the Storch up into the safety of the dark clouds. It was pitch dark when they reached Bergen. Neumann switched off. "So we made it, Herr Reichsleiter. Rather different from Berlin." "You did well," Bormann said. "You're a fine pilot." Bormann got down to the ground, and Neumann passed him the bag. Bormann said, "Such a pity you recognized me." And he shot him through the head. Bormann took a deep breath, could smell the sea on the wind. Strange, but instead of feeling tired, he was full of energy, and he lit a cigarette and leaned back, looking up at the stars and remembering Berlin only as a bad dream. 1992. The hangar was old and smelled damp as if not used in years, but the airplane that stood there, a Cessna 441 Conquest with twin turboprop engines, looked well enough. An engineer in overalls stood on a ladder working on it. Two men loaded boxes inside. As they emerged, one of them called in German, "We're finished, Dr. Wegner." A bearded man in a hunting jacket emerged from the small office. "All right, you can go." As they walked away, he said to the mechanic, "Any problems, Tomic?" "No, just fine-tuning." "Which won't mean a thing unless this damn man Dillon turns up," a young man in a reefer coat said as he came in. "Klaus, he'll be here," Wegner told him. "I was told he could never resist a challenge." "A mercenary," the young man said. "That's what we've come down to, the kind of man who kills people for money." "There are children dying over there," Wegner said, "and they need what's on the plane. To achieve that, I'd deal with the devil himself." "Not kind," Sean Dillon called in excellent German. "Not kind at all," and he stepped out of the darkness. He was a small man, no more than 5'5", with hair so fair that it was almost white. He wore an old black leather flying jacket with a white scarf at his throat, and blue jeans. Wegner said in English, "Mr. Dillon?" "And who might you be, me old son?" His speech had the hard, distinctive edge that was found only in Ulster and not in the Republic of Ireland. I am Dr. Hans Wegner of International Drug Relief, and this is Klaus Schmidt from our office in Vienna. He arranged the plane for us. Did he know? That's something to be said in his favor. The young man flushed deeply, and Wegner said mildly, Herr Schmidt has made the run by road twice with medical supplies. That part of Croatia is disputed territory now. There's heavy fighting between Serbs and Muslims and Croats. I see, Dillon said. So I'm to manage by air what you can't by road. Mr. Dillon, it's 120 miles to Sabak from here. That means you could be there in 20 minutes. Dillon laughed out loud. It's plain you don't know the first thing about flying. He saw the mechanic smiling. Ah, so you speak English, old son? A little. Tomic is a Croatian, Dr. Wegner said. Dillon replied, What do you think? A nice airplane, but no match for a MiG fighter. Tomic shook his head. But maybe you've got a death wish. That's enough, Tomic, Wegner said angrily. Oh, it's been said before, Dillon laughed. I'd better look at the charts. As they moved towards the office, Wegner said, Our people in Vienna made it plain. Your services are purely voluntary. We need all the money we can raise for drugs and medical supplies. Understood, said Dillon. Just before 5, Dillon went up the steps to the Conquest. It was stacked with long, olive-green boxes. What's in these? Dillon asked. Schmidt unclipped the nearest one to reveal morphine ampules. Over there, Mr. Dillon, they sometimes have to hold children down when they operate on them because of the lack of any kind of anesthetic. Point taken, Dillon said. Now close it up and I get moving. Thick clouds, constant rain, and a swirling mist gave only an intermittent view of the pine forest below. Dillon was in trouble. A voice spoke in his earphones in heavily accented English. Good morning, Mr. Dillon. Welcome to Yugoslavia. A MiG-21 took station not too far away, the red stars on its fuselage clear enough. The MiG pilot spoke again. Course 124, Mr. Dillon. We'll come to a rather picturesque castle at the edge of the forest. Kivo, it's called. Intelligence headquarters for this area. There's an airstrip there, and they are expecting you. Who am I to refuse an offer like that? Dillon said cheerfully. He turned onto the new course, whistling softly to himself. A Serbian prison did not commend itself, but he didn't seem to have any choice. A couple of miles away he saw Kivo, a fairy-tale castle, the airstrip clear beside it. Now put down nice and easy, and I'll say goodbye, the MiG pilot said. Dillon sighed and heaved the control column back and boosted power, climbing fast, and the MiG pilot reacted angrily. Do as you're told or I'll blast you out of the sky. Dillon ignored him. The MiG, already on his tail, came up behind and fired. The Conquest staggered as a cannon shell tore through both wings. Dillon, don't be a fool, the pilot cried. But then I always was. Dillon went down fast, leveling at 2,000 feet. Now then, he said into his mic, let's see how good you are. He dropped the nose and went straight down, and the MiG went after him, firing again. The Conquest bucked, the port engine dying as Dillon leveled out at 400 feet, and behind him the MiG, with no time to pull out at the speed it was doing, plowed into the forest and fireballed. Dillon lost power and dropped lower. There was a clearing up ahead. He tried to bank towards it. In the end, it was the pine trees which saved him, retarding his progress so much that by the time he hit the clearing for a belly landing, he wasn't going all that fast. The Conquest bounced to a shuddering halt. Dillon was out head first and running. Soldiers appeared with Dobermans. They stood in a semicircle, guns covering him, the dogs howling. A jeep rolled to a halt, and a major stood up and looked down at him. A good-looking man with a dark, saturnine face. "So, Mr. Dillon, you made it in one piece," he said in faultless public school English. "My name is Branco, John Branco. My mother is English, lives in Hampstead." "Is that a fact?" Dillon smiled. Branco turned and spoke in Serbo-Croat to the large, brutal-looking sergeant behind him, clutching an AK assault rifle. The sergeant smiled and advanced on Dillon. He knew what was coming, but there wasn't a thing he could do. The butt of the AK caught him in the left side, and then there was only darkness. In 1972, aware of the growing problem of terrorism, the British Prime Minister of the day ordered the setting up of a small elite intelligence unit known simply by the code name Group 4. It was to handle all matters concerning terrorism and subversion in the British Isles. It owed allegiance to the Prime Minister alone. Brigadier Charles Ferguson had headed Group 4 since its inception. He was still working at his desk at 9 o'clock that night when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," Ferguson said, a large, rather untidy-looking man with a double chin and grey hair. Detective Inspector Jack Lane, the man who entered, was in his late 30s and wore a tweed suit and glasses. Ferguson had succeeded in borrowing him from Special Branch at Scotland Yard to act as his personal assistant. "Got something for me, Jack?" Ferguson's voice was ever so slightly plummy. "Mainly routine, Brigadier. The word is that the Director General of the Security Services is still unhappy at the Prime Minister's refusal to do away with Group 4's special status." "Good God, don't they ever give up? I've agreed to liaise with Simon Carter, the Deputy Director, and that damned MP, Sir Francis Paymer. Anything else?" Lane smiled. "Oh, actually, I've saved the best bit for last. Dillon. Sean Dillon." Ferguson turned. "What about him?" "Had a signal from our contacts in Yugoslavia. Dillon crashed in a light plane this morning flying medical supplies. Only they turned out to be Stinger missiles. They're holding him in that castle at Kivo." Ferguson nodded in satisfaction. "You know what the Serbs are like, Jack? Might as well stick his record in the dead letter file. Oh, you can go home now." "Good night, sir." Lane left. Ferguson crossed to his drinks cabinet, poured a large Scotch, and said softly, "Chew on that, you bastard, Dillon." In his house on the edge of Cruz Bay, St. John, Henry Baker sat in his study reading. The tail end of Hurricane Abel had swept in that night. He had the door to the veranda open because he liked the rain and the smell of the sea. It took him back to his 2-year service in the Navy during the Korean War. He could have made a career of it, but there was the family publishing business to consider, and the girl he had promised to marry. It hadn't been a bad life, considering. No children, but he and his wife had been content until cancer took her at 50. From then on, he had lost interest in the business, and had been happy to accept the takeover deal which had left him very rich and totally rootless at 58. It was a visit to St. John in the Virgin Islands which had been the saving of him. It was here that he had been introduced to scuba diving by Bob Carney, and it had become an obsession. He had moved to St. John and bought the present place. His life at 63 was totally satisfactory and worthwhile, although Jenny had something to do with that. He reached for her photo. Jenny Grant, 25, face very calm, wide eyes about high cheekbones, short dark hair, and there was still a wariness in those eyes. Hardly surprising when Baker recalled their first meeting in Miami, when she had tried to proposition him in a parking lot, her body shaking from the lack of drugs she'd needed. When she had collapsed, he had taken her to the hospital himself, had personally guaranteed the financing to put her through drug rehabilitation, and held her hand all the way because there was no one else. It was the usual story. She was an orphan raised by an aunt who had thrown her out at 16. A fair voice had enabled her to make some kind of living singing in saloons and cocktail lounges, and then the wrong man, bad company, and the slide had begun. He had brought her back to St. John to see what the sea and sun could do. The arrangement had worked, and on a strictly platonic basis. He was the father she had never known. She was the daughter he had been denied. He had invested in a cafe and bar for her on Cruise Bay waterfront called Jenny's Place. It had proved a great success. Life couldn't be better, and he always waited up for her. It was at that moment that he heard the jeep outside. She came in laughing, a raincoat over her shoulder, leaned down and kissed his cheek. "My God! It's like a monsoon out there." "Oh, it'll be clear by morning, you'll see." He took her hand. "Good night?" "Oh, very," she nodded. "Gosh, but I'm bushed." "No, I'd get to bed if I were you. It's almost 3 o'clock. I may go diving in the morning, but I should be back before noon. I wish you wouldn't dive on your own. Jenny, I work within the limits Bob Carney taught me. No decompression needed, and I never dive without my marathon diving computer. You know that. Now stop worrying and go to bed." She kissed him on the top of his head and went out. He'd returned to his book, but his eyes started to close, and he fell asleep. He came awake with a start. It was a little after 5. He went out on the veranda. It was strangely still, and the sea was extraordinarily calm. Something to do with the hurricane having passed. Perfect for diving. He took the rowder out of the harbour towards the open sea, heading due south. He lapsed into a kind of reverie, and it was a good 30 minutes later that he suddenly snapped out of it and checked his position. 12 miles out, close to the edge of things where everything simply dropped away, and it was 2,000 feet to the bottom except for Thunder Point. No one ever dived there. The most dangerous reef in the entire region. Even Carney didn't dive there. Strong currents, a nightmare world of physios and channels. Not today. It was a mill pond. A sudden excitement surged in him. He dropped anchor, stripped, pulled on the orange and blue nylon diving suit, and assembled his gear. Then he simply stood up and stepped into the water. It was incredibly clear and blue. He started down. The reef where the anchor was hooked was a forest of coral and seagrass, fish of every conceivable description. He checked his dive computer. It not only indicated the depth he was at, but told him how long he was safe there, and constantly altered its reading according to any change in depth he made during the dive. There was a reasonably strong current. He peered over the cliff face into a great blue vault that stretched into infinity. He noted considerable coral damage, presumably the result of the hurricane. Some distance ahead there was a section where what looked like an entire overhang had gone, revealing a wide ledge below. There was something perched on the ledge, part of it hanging over. Baker approached cautiously. It was then that he received not only the greatest thrill of his diving career, but the greatest shock of a long life. The object, which was pressed on the ledge and partly sticking out over 2,000 feet of water, was a submarine. It was the Type 7 U-boat, by far the most common craft of its kind used by the German Kriegsmarine. It was encrusted with marine growth, but he could discern the number on the side. 180. Obviously, the overhang, which had recently been dislodged, had protected it from view for years. He swung over to the starboard side and saw what the trouble had been instantly. A large, ripped gash about 15 feet long in the hull. Poor bastards must have gone down like a stone. He descended and peered into the control room. It was dark and gloomy in there, and he got the spotlight from his dive bag and shone it inside. The periscope shafts were clearly visible, but the rest was a confusion of twisted metal, wires, and pipes. He checked his computer, saw he had 15 minutes, then went inside. He tried the unlocking wheel on the forward hatch, but it was immovable. There were some oxygen bottles, and most pathetic of all, a few human bones in the sediment of the floor. Suddenly he felt cold. He turned to go, and his light picked out a handle in the corner, very like a suitcase handle. He reached for it, and found himself clutching a small briefcase in some kind of metal. It was enough, and he went out through the gash in the hull, drifted up over the edge of the reef, and went for the anchor. He made it with 5 minutes to spare. He pushed the briefcase on board, then wriggled out of his equipment. He schooled himself to do everything as normal, following his usual routine. He changed into jeans and a fresh shirt. He sat in one of the swivel chairs, staring at the briefcase encrusted with coral. He got a wire brush from his toolkit and applied it vigorously. As the aluminum surface cleared, the eagle and swastika was revealed. He found a large screwdriver, forced it in just above the lock, and was able to pry open the lid. The inside was totally dry. The contents, a few photos and several letters. There was also a large diary in red Moroccan leather. The photos were of a young woman and 2 little girls. The first entry of the diary was dated April the 3rd, 1945, and he recognized the name Bergen. He knew that was a port in Norway. On the flyleaf was Korvettenkaptein Paul Friemel, U-180, obviously the captain and owner of the diary. Baker flicked through the pages, totally frustrated at being unable to decipher any of it. The strange thing was that the final entry was dated May the 28th, 1945, when Hitler had committed suicide on May the 1st. He flicked through the pages again. A name jumped out at him, Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. Baker's excitement was intense. He turned the pages and another name came out at him, the Duke of Windsor. Baker sat staring at the page, his throat dry. Then he carefully closed the diary and put it back in the case with the letter and photos. Whatever it was heavy. Had to be. He had a U-boat that had gone down in the Virgin Islands 3 weeks after the end of the war in Europe, a private diary kept by the captain which mentioned the most powerful man in Nazi Germany after Hitler, and the Duke of Windsor. He could go to the authorities, of course, but it had been his find, and he was reluctant to relinquish it. But what in the hell to do next? Then it came to him, and he laughed out loud. Garth Travers, of course. He pushed up to full throttle and hurried back to St. John. In 1951, as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, Baker had first met Garth Travers, a gunnery officer. The two young officers had made a firm friendship, and Travers had gone on to great things, had retired a rear admiral, and since then had written several books on naval aspects of the Second World War. When he reached the house, he knew at once that Jenny wasn't there. He picked up the telephone and dialed London. "It certainly is intriguing," Travers said. "Henry, old son, I must see the diary." "Yes, that's what I thought," Baker said. "There's the overnight flight leaving Antigua around 8 this morning. Gets into London Gatwick at 9 o'clock in the morning. Maybe you could give me a late breakfast." "I'll be looking forward to that," Travers said, and replaced the receiver. Baker made the booking. Plenty of time to pack and get himself ready, but first he had to see Jenny. Cruz Bay was a picturesque little town. Jenny's place was slightly back from the road. There were several booths against the walls, a scattering of marble-topped tables and a long mahogany bar. A large, handsome black man with greying hair was polishing glasses, Billy Jones, the barman. He had scar tissue around the eyes and the slightly flattened nose of a professional prize-fighter. His wife, Mary, was the manager. Baker found Jenny and Mary Jones coming up the steps. Jenny frowned. "Is something wrong?" "I have to go to London this afternoon," he told her. "What is it, Henry?" "Well, something happened when I was diving this morning. I found a wreck about 80 or 90 feet down." "Where was this?" He hesitated. It was not only that he knew she would be thoroughly angry that he had dived a place like Thunder Point. He just wanted to keep the location to himself for the moment. "All I can tell you is that I found a German U-boat from 1945. "My God!" "Oh, I managed to get inside. There was a watertight briefcase. I found the captain's diary inside. It's in German, which I can't read, but there were a couple of names I recognized. Martin Bormann and the Duke of Windsor." She looked slightly dazed. "Henry, what's going on here?" "That is what I would like to know." He took her hand. "Remember that friend of mine, Rear Admiral Travers? Of course, you introduced me to him in Miami. I phoned him earlier. All I know is this could be important, and I found the damn boat. Jenny, me, Henry Baker." She had never seen him so excited, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Want me to come with you?" "Hell, no, there's no need for that. I'll be back in a few days." "Fine." She managed to smile. "Then we'd better get back to the house, and I'll help you pack." It was 10 o'clock when the doorbell rang at the house in Lord North Street. Garth Travers answered the door himself and found Henry Baker standing there in the rain. "My dear chap," Travers said, "for God's sake, come in before you drown." He turned as he closed the door. "You'll stay here, of course." "Oh, if that suits, old buddy." "It's good to hear that description of me again," Travers told him. They went to the large, comfortable kitchen, and Travers put the kettle on for coffee. Baker placed the briefcase on the table. "There it is." "May I?" "That's why I'm here." Travers opened the case. He examined the letters and photos quickly. He opened the diary and glanced at the first page. Perfectly legible. "Your German is fluent, as I recall," Baker said. "Like a native, old boy. I'll do an instant translation into my word processor. Should take no more than an hour and a half. You get yourself some breakfast, ham and eggs in the refrigerator." It was perhaps an hour later that Baker cleared away his breakfast and went into the study. After a while, Travers sat back with a sigh. "Finished. I'll just run it through the copier. It's pretty sensational, and that's putting it mildly. The thing is, what are we going to do?" What on earth do you mean? Read it for yourself. Baker settled himself in the chair by the fire and started to read. Bergen, Norway, 30th of April, 1944. We left Kiel 2 days ago in this present boat designated U-180. We are, to my certain knowledge, carrying the number of a dead ship. My orders from Grand Admiral Dönitz are explicit. My passenger will arrive this evening from Berlin. He will carry a direct order in the Führer's own hand. I will leave our destination to him. There was a gap in the diary, and then another entry for the evening of the same day. An officer in the uniform of an SS general appeared. He took me to one side before boarding and presented me with the order from the Führer himself to accept Reichsleiter Bormann's command and authority. 1st of May. I have given the Reichsleiter the commanding officer's compartment on the port side. It is the one private place we have, though only a felt curtain separates his quarters from the wardroom. As we left Bergen on the evening tide, he informed me that our destination was Venezuela. 8th of May. We received this evening by radio the message I have been expecting. Germany has gone down to defeat. I met with the Reichsleiter, and he demanded my obedience, insisting on his right to speak to the crew over the intercom. He disclosed his identity and his authority from the Führer. He pointed out that there was nothing left for any of us in Germany, and that there were friends waiting in Venezuela. A new life for those who wanted it, the possibility for a return to Germany for those who wanted that. It was difficult to argue with his reasoning, and on the whole my crew and officers accepted it. 21st of May. An extraordinary night for me. The Reichsleiter appeared at dinner, obviously the worse for drink. Later he invited me to his quarters, where he produced a bottle of Scotch whisky and insisted I join him. He drank freely, talking a great deal about the Führer and the final days in the bunker in Berlin. He took out an aluminum Kriegsmarine captain's briefcase like my own and put it on the bunk. By now he was very drunk and told me of his last meeting with the Führer, who had charged him to continue the future of the Third Reich. Then he moved on to the Kameradenwerk, Action for Comrades, an organization set up to continue National Socialist ideas after the war. There were hundreds of millions salted away in Switzerland, South America, and other places. He took his aluminum case from the bunk, opened it, and produced a file. He called it the Blue Book. He said it listed many members of the English aristocracy who had secretly supported the Führer during the 1930s, and also many Americans. He then took a paper out and told me it was the Windsor Protocol, a secret agreement with the Führer signed by the Duke of Windsor. In it, he agreed to ascend to the throne again after a successful German invasion. At this point, he became so drunk that I had to assist him on to the bunk. He fell asleep instantly, and I examined the contents of the briefcase. The names in the Blue Book meant nothing to me, but the Windsor Protocol looked genuine enough. I closed the briefcase and placed it under the bunk with his other luggage. 26th of May. The Reichsleiter called me to his quarters and informed me that it was necessary to make a stop, and requested the chart for the Virgin Islands. The island he indicated is a small one, Samson Key, south-east of St. John. 27th of May. Surfaced off the coast of Samson Key at 2100 hours. A dark night with a quarter moon. The Reichsleiter requested that he be put ashore in one of the inflatables, and I arranged for Petty Officer Schroeder to take him. Before leaving, he called me to his quarters and told me that he was expecting to meet friends on shore, but as a precaution, he was not taking anything of importance with him. He particularly indicated the briefcase, which he left on the bunk, and gave me a sealed envelope which he said would give me details of my destination in Venezuela if anything went wrong. He told me to send Schroeder back for him at 0200 hours, and if he was not on the beach, I was to fear the worst and depart. He wore civilian clothes. 28th of May, midnight. I've just been on the bridge and noticed an incredible stillness. Lightning on the horizon and distant thunder. The waters in the lagoon are shallow and give me concern. There was a gap here, and then a couple of lines of the final entry. Radio report from St. Thomas indicates hurricane approaching fast. We must make for deep water and go down to ride it out. The Reichsleiter must take his chance. Only the poor buggers didn't ride it out, Travers said. The hurricane caught them. Must have ripped her side open on the reef where you found her. Strange no one ever discovered her. Not really, Baker said. It's very dangerous. Another thing, if the recent hurricane hadn't broken away that overhang, I might well have missed it myself. Well, you haven't actually given me the location yet, Travers remonstrated. Yes, well, that's my business, Baker said. Travers smiled. I understand, old boy, but I really must point out that this is a very hot potato. What do you mean, Baker asked. According to the diary, Bormann kept a similar case, and he left it on the bunk in the commanding officer's quarters. These things were built for survival. Even after all these years, the facts contained in those documents would cause a hell of a stink, especially the Windsor thing. I wouldn't want to cause that kind of trouble, Baker told him. I believe you. But what if someone else found the submarine? Travers sat there frowning. Look, I'd like to show the diary to a friend of mine. Who? Brigadier Charles Ferguson. We've known each other for years. He runs a highly specialized anti-terrorist unit responsible only to the Prime Minister. Just let me show him the diary, old boy, Travers said soothingly. See what he thinks. Okay, Baker said, but the location stays my secret. Of course. You can come with me if you want. No, I think I'll have a bath and maybe go for a walk. Just as you like, Travers said. I'll leave you to it. Ferguson sat on the sofa beside the fireplace in his elegant drawing room, and Travers sat opposite. Quite bizarre, isn't it? You believe it, then? The diary? Good God, yes. I mean, you obviously vouch for your friend Baker. I think the Prime Minister should see this. He slipped the papers comprising the diary back into their envelope. Give me a moment. I'm going to send my driver round with this to Downing Street. Eyes of the Prime Minister only. Then I'll see how soon he can see us. I'll be back. He went out of the study. Can't see us until 2 o'clock, Ferguson said when he came back. But I spoke to him personally, and he's going to have a quick look. The Prime Minister was sitting behind his desk in his study when an aide showed Ferguson and Travers in. An incredible business, gentlemen, he said. An understatement, Prime Minister, Ferguson replied. Well, you were quite right to bring this to my attention. The royal aspect is what concerns me most. You recall you agreed to liaise with the Deputy Director Simon Carter and Sir Francis Palmer. I did indeed, Prime Minister. Well, I called both of them in immediately after reading the diary. They've been downstairs having a look at it themselves. They're on their way up. A moment later the door opened and the aide ushered in the two men. Simon Carter was 50, a small man with hair already snow-white. Sir Francis Palmer was 47, tall and elegant in a blue flannel suit. He had a slight smile permanently fixed to the corner of his mouth in a way that Ferguson found intensely irritating. They all shook hands and sat down. "Well, gentlemen," the Prime Minister said. "Always assuming it isn't a hoax," Palmer said. "A fascinating story. And this blue book list that's mentioned, members of Parliament and the nobility," Carter shuddered, "the mind boggles." "My dear Simon," Palmer told him, "there were an awful lot of people around before the war who found aspects of Hitler's message rather attractive. There are also names in that list with a Washington base. Yes, well, their children and grandchildren wouldn't thank you to have their names mentioned. And what in the hell was Bormann doing at the Sampson Key?" "Well, I got my assistant Detective Inspector Lane onto this Sampson Key place," Ferguson said. "During the war there was an hotel, but it was closed, owned by an American family called Herbert. There's a resort there now, one of those rich men's hideaways." "What do you think Bormann was after there?" Palmer asked. "One can only guess," Ferguson said. "A pretty scandal, I agree," the Prime Minister said. "But imagine the furor it would cause if it became known that the Duke of Windsor had signed an agreement with Hitler. The papers would have a field day, and frankly, the royal family has had more than its share of scandal in this past year or so." There was silence, and Ferguson said gently, "Are you suggesting that we attempt to recover Bormann's briefcase before anyone else does, Prime Minister?" "Yes. That would seem the sensible thing to do. Do you think you might handle that, Brigadier?" Simon Carter protested. "Sir, I must remind you that this U-boat lies in American territorial waters." "Well, I don't think we need to bring our American cousins into this," Ferguson said. "They would have total rights to the wreck and the contents. Imagine what they'd get for the Windsor Protocol at auction. Brigadier, you will devise a plan, do whatever is necessary, and as soon as possible. Keep me informed, and also the Deputy Director and Sir Francis." "So the matter is entirely in my hands?" Ferguson asked. "Total authority, just do what you have to." The Prime Minister got up. "And now you really must excuse me." After his bath, Baker had lain on his bed for a moment and fell fast asleep. When he finally awakened and checked his watch, it was shortly after 2 o'clock. He dressed quickly and went downstairs. There was no sign of Travers. It was still raining hard, and in spite of that he decided to go for a walk to clear his head. He helped himself to an old trench coat and an umbrella and went down the steps. He felt good, still excited about the way things were going. In England, people drive on the left-hand side of the road, and yet on that rainy afternoon in London, Henry Baker did what most Americans would do before crossing the road. He looked left and stepped straight into the path of a London transport bus coming from the right. Westminster Hospital being close by, an ambulance was there in minutes. Not that it mattered, for he was dead by the time they reached the casualty department. Jenny Grant walked along the waterfront of the cafe and went up the steps and entered the bar. Mary Jones appeared at the end of the bar. "Telephone call for you in the office, London, England." Jenny smiled instantly. "Henry?" "No." Some woman. Oh, you take it, honey, and I'll get you a cup of coffee. Jenny brushed past her and went into the office, and Mary poured a little water into the coffee percolator. Then there was a sharp cry from inside the office. It was just before 5, and Ferguson closed the glass partition in his Daimler so the driver couldn't hear what was being said. A hell of a shock, Travers said. Leaves us in an interesting situation, Ferguson commented. The location of the U-180. Has it died with him? Of course, Travers said. I was forgetting. On the other hand, perhaps the Grant girl knows. I mean, she lived with him. Not that kind of relationship, Travers told him. Purely platonic. I met her just once. Lovely young woman. Well, let's hope this paragon of all the virtues has the answer to our problem, Ferguson said. And if not, then we'll have to think of something else. At precisely the same time, Francis Paymer, having made a very fast trip from London in his Porsche, was mounting the grand staircase to his country home at Hatherley Court in Hampshire. The house had been in the family for 500 years, and he always visited it with conscious pleasure. But not now. He found his mother propped up in the magnificent four-poster bed, a uniformed nurse sitting beside her. She was 85, and very old and frail, and lay there with her eyes closed. The nurse stood up. Sir Francis, we weren't expecting you. He nodded. You have a break. I want to have a chat with her. The nurse went out, and Paymer sat on the bed and took his mother's hand. She opened her eyes. How are you, darling? He asked. Why, Francis, what a lovely surprise. Her voice was very faded. I had some business not too far away, so I thought I'd call in. That was nice of you, dear. I was talking about Samson Key today. Are you thinking of taking a holiday, dear? If you go and that nice Mr. Santiago is there, do give him my regards. Of course, I'm right, aren't I? It was your mother who brought Samson Key into the family. Yes, dear. Her father, George Herbert, gave it to her as a wedding present. Tell me about the war again, Mother, he said. And Samson Key. Well, the hotel was empty for most of the war. It was small then. And when did you go there? March 1945. You were born the previous July, and your father was serving in government. Just like you, dear, as a junior minister. He was worried about the attacks on London, so he arranged passage for you and me to Samson Key. There was an old man and his wife. Black people. Very nice. Jackson. That was it. May and Joseph. Her voice faded. Did anyone visit, Mother? Visit? She opened her eyes. Only Mr. Strasser. Such a nice man. Your father told me he might be coming. He just appeared one night. He said he'd been dropped off in a fishing boat from Tortola, and then the hurricane came, terrible. We were in the cellar for 2 days, but Mr. Strasser was very good. Such a kind man. Then what happened? Oh, he He stayed with us for quite a while, until June, I think. And then your father arrived. And Strasser? He left after that. He had business in South America, and we came back to England. Your father wasn't in Parliament, so we lived on here. The voice trailed away, and then strengthened. Such a difficult time we had. Goodness knows how we managed to keep you at Eton. How lucky we all were when your father met Mr. Santiago. What wonderful things they did together at Sampson Key. Her eyes closed, and Pema went and put her hands under the cover. You sleep now, Mother. It'll do you good. He closed the door gently, went downstairs, got himself a scotch and sat by the fire thinking. The truth was plain now. His father, a British member of Parliament, had connections with the Nazi Party. The involvement must have been considerable. Francis Pema's blood ran cold, one of the oldest families in England, and he, a junior minister now, but if Ferguson managed the recovery of Bormann's briefcase, he was finished. No doubt his father's name would be in the Blue Book. What to do? The answer was astonishingly simple. Max Santiago. Max would know. He hurried to the study, phoned Carlos Prieto, the general manager at Sampson Key Resort, who informed him that Santiago was staying at the Ritz in Paris. "Be there, Max, be there," he murmured. A voice said in French, "Santiago here, who is this?" "Thank God! Max, this is Francis. I must see you. Something bad's happened. I need your help." "Calm yourself, Francis. Could you be at Gatwick at 6:30 your time?" "I think so." "Good. I'll have a charter waiting for you. We can have dinner and you can tell me all about it." The phone clicked and he was gone. Pema got his passport and traveller's checks. The phone sounded and he found Simon Carter on the line. "There you are." "Baker's dead. Just heard from Ferguson." "Good God," Pema said, and then he had a thought. "Doesn't that mean the location of the U-180 has died with him?" "Well, he certainly didn't tell Travers, but his girlfriend is flying over tomorrow, a Jenny Grant. Ferguson is hoping she knows. Anyway, I'll keep you in touch." Pema went out frowning and drove away. At Garth Travers in Lord North Street, the Admiral and Ferguson finished searching Baker's suitcase. "You don't really expect to find the location of that damned reef among his clothes, do you?" Travers asked. "Stranger things have happened," Ferguson said, then went into the study. The aluminum briefcase was on the desk. "This is it?" "Yes," said Travers. "You copied the translation on your word processor, I presume?" "Yes." "So the disk is still in the machine. Get it out and stick it in the case, also any copy you have." Grumbling, Travers did as he was told. "Now what happens?" "Nothing much. I'll see this young woman tomorrow and see what she has to say." Santiago was in his magnificent suite at the Ritz, an impressively tall man in a dark suit and tie, his hair still quite black in spite of his age. He had the look of a man who was used to getting his own way, and dark, watchful eyes. He turned as Pema was shown in. "My dear Francis, what a joy to see you." He held out a hand. "A glass of champagne. You're needed, I can tell." His English was faultless. You can say that again, Paymer said, and accepted the crystal glass gratefully. Now come and sit down and tell me what the trouble is. When Paymer was finished, Santiago sat there without saying a word. Paymer said, What do you think? Unfortunate, to say the least. I know, I mean, if this business ever got out, Bormann on the island, my mother, my father. Oh, your mother didn't have the slightest idea who Bormann was, Santiago said. Your father did, of course. Dear old Joseph was a fascist all his life, and so was my father. Your father had very heavy links with Nazi Germany before the war, and why not? What sensible person wanted to see a bunch of communists take over? My own father in Cuba at the time was also involved. The Kameradenwerk was set up to take care of the movement in the event of defeat in Europe. It was, and still is, a worldwide network. Your father and my father were just two cogs in the machine. I don't believe it. Francis, how do you think your father was able to hang on to Heatherly Court? Your education at Eton, where did the money come from? Your father didn't even have his salary as an MP after he lost his seat. Over the years, he was allowed to, shall we say, assist with certain business dealings. When my own family left Cuba because of that animal Castro, there were funds made available to us in the United States. I built up the hotel chain, was able to indulge in certain illegal but lucrative forms of traffic. Paymer had always suspected some kind of drug involvement. Look, I don't want to know about that. You do like spending the money, though, Francis, Santiago smiled. And what if someone investigated it? Why should they? Samson Holdings is, as the name implies, a holding company. The name of Paymer appears on none of the boards. But it was grandmother's family who originally owned it. The Herbert people? That was a long time ago. Look, your mother's name was Vale. Her mother's maiden name was Herbert, I admit, but I doubt that any connection would be made. Now, this Rear Admiral Travers, what's his address? Lord North Street. I'll get someone to pay him a call. Though be careful, your people, Paymer said. I don't want a scandal. That's exactly what you will have if we don't get in first on this thing. I'll get one of my people to check out this young woman. What was her name? Jenny Grant. I'll have flights checked to see when she's arriving. And then what? Santiago smiled. Why, we'll have to hope she'll be able to tell us something, won't we? Paymer felt sick. Look, Max, they won't hurt her or anything. Poor old Francis. What a thoroughly spineless creature you are. Just after Travers was driven away in Ferguson's limousine to pick up Jenny at Gatwick, a British telecom van parked outside Travers' house. A telephone engineer in official overalls got out with a toolbox in one hand. He had the name Smith on his pocket. He went up the stairs to the kitchen door, punched a gloved hand through the glass pane, reached in and opened it. A moment later, another telecom engineer joined him. On his pocket was Johnson. Once inside, they worked their way methodically through the Admiral's study, searching. Finally, Smith said, Waste of time. It ain't here. He unplugged the Admiral's word processor and put it in the back of the van. What else? Johnson said. Well, see if there's a television or video, then take his typewriter. Johnson did as he was told. When he returned to the living room, Smith was screwing the head of the phone back into place. You're tapping the phone? Why not? We might hear something to our advantage. Is that smart? I mean, the kind of people we're dealing with, intelligence people, they're not rubbish. Look, to all intents and purposes, this is just another hit-and-run burglary, Smith told him. Anyway, Mr. Santiago wants a result on this one, and you don't screw around with him, believe me. Now, let's get moving. Travers recognized Jenny Grant at once as she emerged into the arrival hall at Gatwick. She looked strained, dark circles under her eyes. "Jenny," he said as he approached, "do you remember me, Garth Travers?" "Of course I do, Admiral." She tried to smile and failed miserably. He put his hands lightly on her shoulders. "You look bushed, my dear. Let's get out of here. I've a car waiting." As they drove away, he said, "I expect you to stay with me, naturally, if that's all right." "You're very kind. Will you do something for me? Will you tell me exactly what happened?" "From what witnesses have told the police, he simply looked the wrong way and stepped in front of a bus." He took her hand. "What a bloody stupid way to go." There was anger in her voice now. "I know. Life's a bit of a bad joke sometimes." The surprise at Lord North Street was the police car. The front door stood open, and Travers hurried up the street, Jenny behind him. He went inside and found the chaos in his study, and a policewoman in the kitchen. "Admiral Travers," the policewoman said. "Typical daytime robbery, I'm afraid, sir. They gained access through that door." She indicated the hole in the glass. Travers said, "The bloody swine." "They were in a telecom van. Someone saw them leave. Now, if I could have full details of what's missing." "Yes, of course. Just give me a moment. There's just a chance there could be more to this than meets the eye, officer. I'll just make a phone call and I'll be with you directly." "Seems like a run-of-the-mill robbery, sir," Detective Inspector Lane said. "They only took the kind of portable items that convert to quick cash. Rather fortunate I relieved Travers of the diary and the translation software." "You really think it could have been that, sir?" "All I know is that I learned a long time ago to suspect all coincidence, Jack." "But how do you think they know about the existence of the diary?" Ferguson frowned. "I've got a thought. Get one of your old friends who specializes in bugging devices to do a sweep. You really Jack, I'm merely considering all the options." Lane went out and Ferguson picked up the phone and rang Travers. "How's your guest?" "Fine. Bearing up remarkably well." Ferguson looked at his watch. "Bring her to my place in Cavendish Square at about 12:30. Santiago was still in his suite at the Ritz when the man who called himself Smith phoned from London. "Not a thing, Gov." "Hardly surprising, but it was worth checking," Santiago said. "A nice clean job, I trust?" "Sure, Gov. Oh, I tapped the phone just in case you wanted to listen in." "You did what?" Santiago was coldly angry. "I told you these are intelligence people, the kind of people who check everything." "Sorry, I thought I was doing the right thing." "Never mind. It's too late now. Just wait to hear from me." Santiago put the phone down. In the living room at Cavendish Square, Jenny sat beside the fire opposite Ferguson and Travers. "So you see, Miss Grant," Ferguson said, "there will have to be a coroner's inquest which is set for the day after tomorrow." "And can I have the body for cremation, then?" His lawyer had drawn up a power of attorney in my name. Ferguson looked the paper over. I'll see that it's passed on to the coroner. Now, did Mr. Baker tell you why he was coming to London? She looked at him. Why do you think he came here, Brigadier? Because he discovered the wreck of a German submarine somewhere off St. John, Miss Grant. Did he tell you about it? Jenny Grant took a deep breath. Yes, Brigadier, he did tell me. He said he had been diving and he had discovered a submarine and a briefcase. This case, he said, as he produced the aluminum briefcase, with the diary inside. What else did he tell you? Well, it was in German, which he didn't understand, but he did recognize the name Martin Bormann and the Duke of Windsor. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but not crazy at all, my dear. And where did Mr. Baker find this U-boat? I've no idea. He wouldn't tell me. Ferguson sighed. You're absolutely certain? Of course I am. He said he didn't want to tell me for the time being. She shrugged. If you want my opinion, it could only happen if it was somewhere remote and far out, but I'm not much of a diver. You'd need to go to an expert. And is there such a person? Oh, sure. Bob Carney. Ferguson picked up his pen and made a note. Bob Carney. And who might he be? He has the water sports concessions at Canal Bay Resort. He's quite famous. He was in the oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico, salvage work and all that stuff. Really? Ferguson said. He's the best diver in the Virgin Islands, then? In the whole Caribbean, Brigadier, she said. Good. Many thanks for your cooperation, Miss Grant. Ferguson was having a cup of tea and thinking about things a half-hour later when Lane arrived. The inspector dropped a black metal bug on the coffee table. You were right, sir. This little bastard was in the study telephone. So, Ferguson said, picking it up, the plot thickens. Look, sir, Baker knew about the diary because he found it. The girl knew, the Admiral knew, you know, the PM had a copy, Carter knew, and Sir Francis Paymer knew. But who would knock off Admiral Travers' pad? Ferguson sighed. It's like a spider's web. So what are we going to do, sir? I mean, we don't even know where the bloody U-boat is. On top of that, we have all sorts of dirty work going on, burglary, phone tapping. You're right, Jack. The whole thing assumes a totally new dimension. Well, it might be better to bring intelligence in on it, sir. Hardly, although when you get back to the office, you may phone Simon Carter and Sir Francis and tell them the girl says she doesn't know the site. But then what, sir? Someone who knows diving? Well, that's a thought. But if there is skullduggery afoot, someone who's just a bigger villain as the opposition. Correction. Someone who is worse. My dear Jack, isn't life delicious on occasion? I spend ages getting someone I positively detest banged up, the cell door locked tight, and suddenly discover he's exactly what I need in the present situation. I don't understand, sir. You will, Jack. Ever been to Yugoslavia? In Paris, Santiago was about to leave for a lunch appointment when the phone rang. It was Francis Paymer. Carter spoke to Ferguson. He said the girl doesn't know the location of the U-boat, Paymer told him. Does Ferguson believe her? Apparently. What about the girl? Where is she staying? Santiago asked him. With Admiral Travers at Lord North Street. She could be telling the truth, and there's only one way to find out. What do you mean? Why, by asking her, Francis, in the proper way, of course. A little persuasion works wonders. Oh, for God's sakes, Max, just do what's necessary. Keep me posted, and I'll have the girl taken care of. Dillon was reading a book, head propped up against the pillow, when the door opened and Major Branco entered. "Ah, there you are," he said. Dillon didn't bother getting up. "What do you want?" "I brought someone to see you, hardly an old friend, but I'd listen to what he'd had to say if I were you." Ferguson entered the room, followed by Jack Lane. "Holy Mother of God," Dillon said. "Brigadier Charles Bloody Ferguson, head of Group 4. "Dear me, Dillon, but you are up the creek without a paddle, aren't you?" Ferguson dusted off the only chair with his hat and sat. "This is Jack Lane, my assistant on loan from Scotland Yard, so he doesn't like you." Lane's face was like stone. "Look at him, Jack," Ferguson said. "The great Sean Dillon. Soldier of the IRA in his day, master assassin, better than Carlos the Jackal, some say." "I am looking, sir, and all I see is just another killer." "You must have been out of your mind," Ferguson said. "Medical supplies for the sick and dying." "You?" We all have our off days. Stinger missiles as well. So you didn't even check the cargo properly. You must be losing your touch." "What do you want?" Ferguson got up and went to the window. "They've been shooting Croatians down there in the courtyard. It'll be your turn unless you're sensible." "You mean I have a choice?" Dillon asked calmly. "You could say that," Ferguson said. "The thing I'm interested in at the moment was that underwater job you did for the Israelis. I have a job that requires a man of your peculiar talents and considerable diving skills." Where would all this take place?" "The American Virgin Islands," Ferguson said. "The choice is yours, Dillon. You can stay here and be shot, or you can leave now." Dillon hesitated. "I'm a wanted man over there in the UK. Slate wiped clean, my word on it. Of course, you'll have to do exactly as you're told." "Of course." Dillon picked up his flying jacket and pulled it on. "Yours to command." Dillon finished the diary and closed it. The Irishman passed the diary to Ferguson, who sat across the aisle from him. "So, when do you want me to go out to the Virgins?" "I'm not sure. 2 or 3 days?" Ferguson eased a pillow behind his head. "And where do I stay while I'm hanging around in London?" Dillon inquired. "I'll arrange for you to stay with Admiral Travers in Lord North Street. For the moment, you can earn your keep by keeping an eye on the girl," Ferguson told him. "All my instincts tell me there's someone out there, and they're up to no good. I need a spot of shut-eye." He closed his eyes. Dillon leaned back, thinking. "Just one thing, Brigadier. I presume the Stinger missiles were your idea." "Wanted to see you behind bars?" Ferguson shrugged. "Lucky for you this situation arose." "Or you'd have let me rot." "Not really. They'd have shot you sooner or later." Well, you might say it's all come out in the wash." And he closed his eyes and dozed himself. At Lord North Street, just before 6, it was still raining as Dillon sat at the kitchen table and watched Jenny Grant make the tea. He'd only just been introduced, and Ferguson was closeted in the study with Travers. "Would you mind if I smoked?" Not at all. She busied herself with the tea things. You're Irish, but you sound different. North of Ireland, he said. She poured the tea. And would I be correct in assuming the Brigadier wants you to keep an eye on me? And why would you think that? Because you look like that kind of man. And how would you be knowing that sort of person, Miss Grant? Jenny, she said. And I used to know all sorts of men, Mr. Dillon, and they were usually the wrong kind. But Henry saved me from all that. She looked up and her eyes glistened. And now he's gone. Another cup? He reached for the pot. And what do you do in St. John? I have a cafe and bar called Jenny's Place. You must visit sometime. You know what? Dillon smiled. I might just take you up on that. Ferguson and Travers came into the kitchen. Ferguson said, Right, you two, I'm off. We'll all meet for dinner at 8, the River Room at the Savoy, I think. Dillon said, a jack and tie job that, and here's me with only the clothes I'm standing up in. All right, Dillon, you can go shopping tomorrow, Ferguson said wearily and turned to Travers. Garth, you can fix him up with a blazer, I'm sure. See you later. The Admiral, Dillon, and Jenny reached the Savoy and went to the River Room. I suppose we might as well have a drink, Travers said. Dillon turned to the wine waiter. A bottle of Krug non-vintage, he smiled amiably at Travers. I prefer the grape mix. Do you indeed? The Admiral said stiffly. Yes. Dillon offered Jenny a cigarette. She was wearing a simple white blouse and black skirt. You're looking rather nice. His voice had changed, and for the moment he was the perfect English gentleman. Are you ever the same for 5 minutes? Jays, I said, wouldn't that be a bore? Let's dance. He reached for her hand and led her to the floor. You know, you're not looking too bad yourself, she said. Where's the blazer, Fritz? She leaned back as they circled the floor. You know, I get a funny feeling about you. It may sound crazy, but if someone asked me to speculate about you, I'd say you were a soldier. I suppose you could put it that way. The music stopped. He took her back to the table and excused himself. As he went away, the Admiral said, Look, my dear, no sense in getting too involved with him, you know. Not your sort. Oh, don't be an old snob, Admiral, she lit a cigarette. He seems perfectly nice to me. Travers snorted and came right up with it. Soldier of the bloody IRA. She frowned. You can't be serious. Infamous character, Travers said. They've been after him for years. Only reason he is here is because he's going to help out with this thing, go to St. John, find the submarine, and so on. Apparently the damn man's also a diver. I can't believe it. Dillon came back to the table with Ferguson. You're looking well, my dear, Ferguson said to Jenny. The coroner's inquest is at 10:30 tomorrow, by the way. How soon after that can we arrange the cremation? I'm not expecting a service. Henry was an atheist. Ferguson shrugged. Oh, they could do it virtually straight away. Good, if you would arrange it, I'd be grateful. She reached for Dillon's hand. And I'd like to dance again, she smiled. It's not often I get the chance to do the foxtrot with an IRA gunman. The following morning there were no more than 5 or 6 people in the small oak-panelled court in Westminster. Jenny sat in front with Ferguson and Dillon at the back. Smith and Johnson came into the court and sat on a bench on the other side of the aisle from Dillon. They were both respectably dressed. But one look was enough for Dillon. 20 years of entirely the wrong kind of living had given him an instinct for such things. After the proceedings, Smith and Johnson got up and filed out with the other people. It was sunny outside. Dillon was standing on the top step as Ferguson joined him. Dillon said, "Do you know those two?" "Why should I?" the brigadier asked. "My instincts tell me we've got a couple of bad guys there." "Perhaps you're right, Dillon." The Daimler drew up and Jack Lane got out and joined them. "Everything go off all right, sir?" "Yes, Jack." Lane scowled, took an envelope from his pocket and held it out to Dillon. "A damn sight more than you deserve." "You need clothes, don't you?" Ferguson said. "There's a charge card and £1,000. Dillon took it. An American Express Platinum card in his own name. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Isn't this going a little over the top, Brigadier? It's all part of the new persona I'm creating for you. You'll be told about it at the right time. Good, Dillon said. Then I'll be on my way. I'll get spending. As the Daimler was driving towards the Ministry of Defence, the car phone sounded. Lane answered, then glanced up at Ferguson, his hand over the receiver. "The Deputy Director, Brigadier. He says he'd like an updating. Wonders whether you could meet him and Sir Francis at Parliament." Ferguson said to Lane, 4:30 to 5. Ferguson looked positively wicked. "I'll take Dillon along and introduce him. Just imagine, the Carlos of our times on the terrace of the House of Parliament. I can't wait to see Simon Carter's face." Ferguson and Dillon got into the Daimler. Ferguson said to him, "I've an appointment to meet the Deputy Director of the Security Services, Simon Carter, and a junior minister called Sir Francis Paymer on the terrace of the House of Parliament. I'm supposed to keep them informed, and I thought it might be amusing to take you along. After all, Carter's been trying to get his hands on you for years." "Holy Mother of God," Dillon said, "but you are a wicked man." "Well, at least you look respectable," Ferguson said, taking in Dillon's double-breasted blazer and grey flannels. "Thanks to your Amex card," Dillon told him. They came to the central lobby of the House of Commons, and Ferguson led the way out through an entrance to the terrace overlooking the Thames. There were lots of people about, some with a glass in their hand enjoying a drink. Westminster Bridge to the left, the embankment on the far side of the river. As Dillon lit a cigarette, Ferguson said, "Here they are now." Paymer led the way along the terrace bar, and they found seats in the corner. He and Carter ordered gin and tonics, Ferguson Scotch. Dillon smiled. "I'll have an Irish and water. Bushmills, if you have it." He had deliberately stressed his Ulster accent, and Carter was frowning. "Dillon, did you say? I don't think we've met before." "No," Dillon said amicably, "although not for want of trying on your part, Mr. Carter. Sean Dillon." Carter's face was very pale now, and he turned to Ferguson. "Is this some sort of practical joke? You'd bring a damned scoundrel like this here, a man that intelligence services has hunted for years? But he's working for Group 4 now." Carter was seething. "But to business," Ferguson said calmly. "There was a burglary at Lord North Street. We did discover a bug in the telephone. When we were at the inquest on Baker this morning, Dillon noticed two men who gave him pause for thought." Carter frowned. "But who could it be?" "God knows, but Dillon will proceed to St. John and take it from there. The girl mentioned a diver, a man named Bob Carney, who was a close friend of Baker. Apparently he knows the area like the back of his hand." Ferguson looked at his watch. We'll have to go. He stood and led the way outside. Dillon smiled at the two men. It's been a sincere pleasure, but one thing, Mr. Carter. He leaned over the parapet and looked down at the brown water of the Thames. Only 15 feet, I'd say. Maybe less when the tide's up. All that security at the front door and nothing here. I'd think about that if I were you. Too not current out there, Paymer said. Not that I can swim myself, never could. Should be enough to keep the wolves at bay. Dillon walked away and Carter said, It makes my skin crawl to think of that little swine walking around here a free man. Ferguson must be crazy. At his suite in Paris, Mac Santiago listened patiently to Paymer. Astonishing, he said when Paymer finished. This Dillon could be a formidable opponent. What about the girl? I don't know, Francis. We'll have to see. I'll be in touch. He put the phone down momentarily, picked it up again, and rang Smith in London, and when he answered, told him exactly what he wanted him to do. It was just after 6, and Jenny was in the kitchen and Dillon was in the study. Jenny had to get out. She needed air. When she opened the door, she saw it had started to rain. She belted her coat and hurried along the pavement, and Smith, sitting in the van with Johnson, saw her pass. Perfect, Smith said. Let's get on with it. And he got out and went after her, with Johnson at his heels. Dillon was aware first of the silence. Jenny, he called, and then noticed the door was slightly ajar. For God's sakes, he said, and went out putting his jacket on. There was no sign of her, the street deserted. He'd have to take a chance. Turned left and ran along the pavement toward Great Peter Street. It was almost dark as Jenny crossed to the wall overlooking the Thames. She took a few deep breaths to steady herself and felt better. It was at that moment she heard a movement behind her. She knew she was in trouble at once. No need to panic, darling, Smith said. A little conversation is all we need, a few answers. Johnson was on her like a flash, pinning her arms back and forcing her back against the wall. As she struggled desperately, he smiled. I like that. Do it some more. Leave off, Smith told him. Now, about this U-boat in the Virgin Islands. You don't really expect us to believe you don't know where it is. She tried to struggle, and Johnson said, Go on. Answer the man, or I'll give you a slapping. A voice called, Put her down. You want trouble? You got it, you little squirt, Smith said, and swung a tremendous punch. Dillon swayed to one side, reaching for the wrist, twisted so that Smith cried out in agony, falling to one knee. Dillon's clenched fist swung down in a hammer blow across the extended arm, snapping the forearm. Smith fell over on his side. Johnson threw Jenny to one side and took an automatic pistol from his raincoat pocket. Dillon moved in fast, blocking the arm to the side so that the only shot Johnson got off went into the ground. At the same time, the Irishman half-turned, throwing the other man across his extended leg, ramming his heel down so hard that he fractured 2 of Johnson's ribs. Johnson writhed on the ground, and Dillon picked up the automatic. He crouched down beside Johnson. Who do you work for, Sonny? Don't say a word, Smith called. Suit yourself. Dillon rolled him over, put the muzzle of the gun against the back of his left knee, and fired. Johnson gave a terrible cry. Do you want me to do the other one? I'll put you on sticks if you like. No, Johnson moaned. We work for Santiago, Mac Santiago. Really? Dillon said. And where would I find him? He lives in Puerto Rico, but lately he's been in Paris. And you did the burglary at Lord North Street? Yes. Good boy. See how easy it was. You stupid bugger, Smith said to Johnson. You've just dug your own grave. Dillon tossed the gun into the Thames. I'd say he's been very sensible. He took Jenny's arm. Come on, love. Let's get home. My God, she said wonderingly. What kind of man are you, Sean Dillon, to do that? They'd have done worse to you, my love. He took her hand and ran with her across the road. When they reached the house, she went straight upstairs. As Dillon went to join her, he realized she was on the phone. British Airways? What's the last flight to Paris tonight? She put the phone down a minute later and turned as Dillon entered. Doing a runner, are you? I can't take it. I don't understand what's going on. I can't get it out of my mind. I was going away anyway, but I'm going to get out now while I can. To Paris, he said. I heard you on the phone. That's just a jumping-off point. There's someone I have to see, someone I want to take this to. She picked up the black metal box containing the ashes of Henry Baker. Henry's sister. Sister? Dillon frowned. I'm probably about the only person left who knows he had one. Don't ask me where I'm going. I see. She glanced at her watch. Don't tell Ferguson, not until I've gone. Help me, Dillon, please. Then don't waste your time talking about it. Go get your bags, and I'll take you myself. She turned and hurried out on Dillon's side and said softly, You daft bastard. What's getting into you? They were at Heathrow by 8 o'clock. Time for a drink, Dillon suggested. Why not? She seemed in better spirits now. It's good to be on the move again, to get away from it all. What about you? St. John, next stop. See Bob Carney, she said. Tell him I sent you and introduce yourself to Billy and Mary Jones. They're running the cafe and bar for me while I'm away. What about you? When will you be back? I don't honestly know. I'll see how I feel. I'll look you up when I get back if you're still there. The flight was called. You're quite a guy, Dillon. She kissed him on the cheek. Frightening, mind you, but thank God you're on my side. I'll see you. Dillon watched her go, then turned and made his way to the nearest row of telephones. Brigadier, I found out who the opposition is. Good God, who? Santiago. Max Santiago. He lives in Puerto Rico, but recently in Paris. By the way, his people also did the burglary. How did you find this out? I had a run-in with our two friends from the coroner's court. I see. I hope you didn't have to kill anyone. And why would you say a thing like that? Well, Brigadier, I feel like an early night, he said, and hung up. It was just after 9 when Jenny Grant braked her rental car outside the convent of the Little Sisters of Pity in the village of Briach, 5 miles outside Bayeux. She had driven through the night, was totally drained. A young novice was raking the gravel drive. Jenny got out holding the travelling urn. I'd like to see the Mother Superior. It's most urgent. She was led through pleasant gardens to a small chapel. The young novice went in and whispered to the nun who knelt in prayer at the altar rail. The Mother Superior came towards her, a tall woman in her 50s with a sweet, serene face. How may I help you? Sister Maria Baker? That's right. She looked puzzled. I'm Jenny. Jenny Grant. Henry told me he had spoken to you about me. Sister Maria Baker smiled. But of course. And then she looked concerned. There's something wrong. What is it? Henry was killed in an accident in London the other day. I brought you his ashes. Oh, my dear. There was pain in Sister Maria Baker's face, and she crossed herself and took the urn. It was so kind of you to do this. Yes, but it wasn't just that. I don't know which way to turn. So many awful things have happened. Jenny burst into tears. Sister Maria Baker put her hand on her head. "What is it, my dear?" When Jenny was finished, Sister Maria Baker said, "Mystery upon mystery. Henry's unfortunate discovery is of critical importance to many people. But enough of that now. You need a few days of total rest. I am a doctor, you know. We're a nursing order. Now let's find you a room." And they went out together, leaving the chapel to the quiet. When Dillon and Travers were shown into the flat at Cavendish Square, Ferguson was sitting by the fire going over a file, and Jack Lane was standing by the window. "What in the hell are you playing at?" Ferguson said. She had had enough. The attack by the two apes in Victoria Tower Gardens finished her off. So you just decided to go along with her. Dillon lit a cigarette. "She told me she wanted to see Baker's sister." Lane cut in. "We did a check at Charles de Gaulle. She hired a car at the Avis desk." "And after that, who the hell knows?" Ferguson was coldly angry. Dillon shrugged. "She returned to St. John when she's ready." "Well, at least we have some sort of lead. Tell him, Jack." Lane said, "Max Santiago is the driving force behind a hotel group in the States, home in Puerto Rico. Suspicion of having contacts with the Colombian drug cartel. It gets worse. A direct link to the Samson Key Holding Company, and apparently Santiago's father was a great friend of General Franco of Spain, an absolutely rabid fascist." "But how did Santiago know about Baker finding U-180? I mean, how did he know about him coming to London, staying with the Admiral, Jenny, me? He does seem singularly well informed." Ferguson said, "We'll find the answer in time. For the moment, we just have to get on with it. You'll leave for the Caribbean tomorrow." Dillon said, "Will Max Santiago turn up there?" "Well, we just have to see. Your cover's quite simple, Dillon. You're a wealthy Irishman with a company in Cork. When you arrive in Antigua, there'll be a seaplane waiting for you. You can land on sea or on land." Ferguson passed a folder across. "2 passports, Irish and British in your own name. You'll also find tickets and traveller's checks in there. You'll be staying at Kinneil Bay, one of the finest resorts in the world." "It sounds like my kind of place." "Contact this diver Jenny mentioned, Bob Carney," Ferguson said. Dillon glanced at a brochure with a photo of Captain Bob Carney. "And that's it, then." Ferguson got up. "I'd better bring Simon and Carter up to date, but I suppose I must see you off in the right style. Bring him to the Garrick for dinner at 7:30, Garth. No, you must excuse me." In Paris, Santiago, who was going to a black-tie dinner at the American Embassy, was adjusting his tie when the phone rang. It was Paymer, and Santiago listened. "So they know your name, Max." Paymer was very agitated. "All thanks to those damned men who were working for you." "Forget them," Santiago said. "They're yesterday's news." Paymer was horrified. "All right, Max, but what are we going to do?" "They can't lay a finger on me. I'm an American citizen, and they don't want to include the American government in this thing." "So what will you do?" "I'll fly to Puerto Rico in the morning and then sail down to Samson Key and operate from there." Dillon, suitably attired in his blazer, followed Travers up the imposing stairway at the Garrick Club. "Ah, there you are," Ferguson said. "Thought we'd have a spot of champagne to wish you bon voyage, Dillon. You prefer Krug, as I recall?" Ferguson took an envelope from his pocket and passed it across. "Just in case things get rough, there's the name of a contact of mine in the main town in St. Thomas. What you might call a dealer in hardware." "Hardware?" Travers looked bewildered. "What on earth would he need with hardware?" Dillon put the envelope in his pocket. "You're a lovely feller, Admiral, and long may you stay that way." Ferguson toasted Dillon. Good luck, my friend. You're going to need it. It was a perfect afternoon. The limitless blue sky with only the occasional cloud as Dillon drifted across the Caribbean at 5,000 feet in his Cessna seaplane. It was pure pleasure, the sea constantly changing color from green to blue. He found Cruz Bay without difficulty and drifted in for a perfect landing just outside the harbor. He entered the harbor and found the ramp. Several uniformed officials checked his passport and looked at his luggage. A young woman in a rose-pink uniform came forward. "I've got your jeep, Mr. Dillon. Conneaut Bay is only a couple of miles out." "You've been very kind," Dillon said, and drove away. Dillon took to Conneaut from the moment he got there. The grounds were an absolute delight, and 7D had a superb shower room, a bar area with a spare icebox, and the bedroom-cum-sitting room was enormous and very pleasantly furnished. There was also a large terrace and a small beach below. A cellular phone plus a spare battery were put on the coffee table. Dillon opened the icebox under the bar unit and opened a half bottle of champagne, poured a glass, then went out and stood on the terrace looking out over the water. The sparkle on the water was too seductive, and a moment later he was hurrying down to the empty beach. The water was incredibly warm and clear. Dillon swam lazily out to sea in the direction of the moored yachts, then swam back. Behind him, the Maria Blanco came round the point and dropped anchor about 300 yards away. The Maria Blanco had cost Santiago $2 million and was his favorite toy. Of course, it had every conceivable luxury and needed a captain and a crew of 5 to man her. Santiago sat on a table on the upper deck enjoying the sun and a cup of excellent coffee. Algaro stood behind him. Algaro wasn't particularly large, but immensely powerful, with a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to the mouth. He was totally devoted to Santiago, who had saved him from a life sentence for the stabbing to death of a young prostitute by the liberal dispensing of funds, not only to lawyers, but corrupt officials. The captain, Julian Serra, a burly, black-bearded man in uniform, sat opposite. He, like most of Santiago's employees, had been with him for years. An inquiry had confirmed that Dillon had arrived at Cottage 7 at Conneaut. "So, you see, my dear Serra, we have a problem on our hands. The man Dillon will probably approach this diver, Bob Carney. Wrecks are notoriously difficult to find, senor," Serra told him. "I agree," Santiago said. "In the meantime, we'll surprise Mr. Dillon as much as possible." He smiled at Algaro. "Think you can handle that?" "With pleasure, senor," Algaro said. "I want you to go ashore tonight. Take Guerra with you." "Do I give him a problem?" Algaro asked hopefully. "A small one, Algaro. Nothing too strenuous." Dillon had finished the grilled sea scallops, Caesar salad, and Caribbean lobster tail by 9 o'clock and wandered down to reception. Algaro was sitting in one of the leather armchairs. "Tell me, do you know a bar called Janny's Place?" he asked the girl on duty. "Just past Mongoose Junction," she replied. He drove in, then walked along the front of the harbor and entered. Dillon found a vacant stool at the bar and waited until Billy Jones was free to deal with him. "Irish whiskey, whatever you've got, and water." He noticed Bob Carney seated at the bar talking to a couple of men who looked like seamen. Dillon recognized him from the photo in the brochure. Billy had brought the whiskey, and Dillon said, "Dillon's the name. Sean Dillon. I'm staying at Conneaut. Johnny told me to look you up and say hello." Billy frowned. "When you see Miss Jenny?" In London? You did? Billy called his wife over. She joined them. This is my wife, Mary. We've been so worried, Mary said when Dillon told her his news of Jenny. Well, I thank you for that. A customer called from one of the tables. I'll see you later. She hurried away and Billy grinned. I'm needed too, but hang around, man, hang around. He went to serve 3 clamoring customers. Dillon looked around the room. Algaro and Guerra were drinking beer in a corner booth. Dillon's eyes barely paused, yet he recognized Algaro from reception at Keneal. The brutal face, the scar. Judas Iscariot come to life, Dillon murmured. The 2 men Carney had been talking to had moved on, and Dillon moved along the bar. Do you mind if I join you? Carney's eyes were very blue in the tanned face. Should I? Sean Dillon. I'm staying at Keneal. Jenny Grant told me to look you up. I was just with her in London. Her friend Henry Baker was killed in an accident over there. I heard about that. She said she'd be back in a few days. The thing is, I'm interested in doing a little diving, and Jenny suggested I speak to you. Said you were the best. Well, that's nice of her. You can count on it. Fine. Tell me something. You see those 2 guys in the booth in the corner? Do you happen to know who they are? Sure, Carney said. They work on a big motor yacht from Puerto Rico owned by a man called Santiago. The younger guy is the mate. The other guy is a real son of a bitch called Algaro. He's the kind of guy to step around. I remember that. Dillon got up. Maybe I could buy you a drink tomorrow night. Hell, I'm here every night, Carney said. Otherwise I'd starve. My wife and kids are away on vacation. I'll see you then, Dillon said. He walked through the crowd. Carney noticed Algaro and Guerra get up and leave. He almost went after them, but Dillon was perfectly capable of looking after himself. Carney never been more certain of anything in his life. Dillon drove out of Cruz Bay thinking about Carney. He had liked him straight away, a calm, quiet man of enormous inner strength. He was suddenly aware of headlights coming up behind him very fast. As the Land Rover moved right in on his tail, he knew he was in trouble. An instant before it bumped him, he put his foot down hard and pulled away, driving so fast that he went past the turning for Keneal Bay. The Land Rover suddenly moved alongside. He caught a brief glimpse of Algaro's face, then the car swerved in, and Dillon spun off the road into the brush, bounced down a shallow slope and came to a halt. Dillon rolled out of the Jeep and got behind a tree. The Land Rover had stopped. Suddenly a shotgun roared. A voice called, "Welcome to St. John, Mr. Dillon," and the Land Rover drove away. Dillon waited until the sound had faded into the night. Then he drove back to the Keneal turning. In London, it was 3:30 in the morning when the phone went at the side of Ferguson's bed. "For God's sake, Dillon, do you know what time it is? A couple of goons just tried to run me off the road, old son. And guess who they are? Crewmen on Santiago's yacht, the Maria Blanco. They also loosed off a shotgun in my direction. I've only been in the damned place a few hours, and yet they knew me by name. I'd say they were expecting me. And how could that be, Brigadier?" "I don't know," Ferguson told him. "That's all I can say." "You're settled in all right?" "I've an insane desire to laugh," Dillon told him. "But yes, I'm settled in fine, and I'm diving with Bob Carney." "Good. Watch yourself." Ferguson put the phone down, switching off the light, and lay there thinking about it. Dillon went to the address Ferguson had given him in St. Thomas. He selected an AK assault rifle, a handgun, a Belgian semi-automatic with a magnet on the back, Semtex underwater explosive, a night sight, and a pair of binoculars. He was walking along the side of the harbour when he saw the Keneal ferry was in. Dillon went into the main cabin and accepted a rum punch. He checked his watch and was aware of someone slumping down beside him. "Fancy meeting you, dear boy," Charles Ferguson said. Max Santiago, wearing a white linen suit, was sitting in Canil Bay Bar, sipping a mint julep when Algaro came in. "Did everything go well?" Santiago asked. "Absolutely. I put a bug on both of Carney's dive boats. That means we can follow him wherever he goes without being observed. Also, Ferguson booked in." "Good," Santiago said. Captain Siraj entered at that moment. "Have you any further orders, senor?" "Go back to the Maria Blanco, pick up some of the crew, and take them into cruise. They can have a drink on me later. Let off a little steam if you follow me." "Perfectly, senor." Siraj smiled and went out. It was just after midnight at the convent of the Little Sisters of Pity, and Jenny Grant, who had gone to bed early, was restless and unable to sleep. She wondered what was happening in St. John and how Dillon was getting on. Finally she dozed off and had a dream of the U-boat in dark waters and Henry diving deep. Such an idiot to have been down there. Somewhere dangerous, somewhere unusual, somewhere people didn't normally go. It had to be. She came awake in the instant and spoke out loud in the darkness. "Oh, my God! Of course! And so simple!" She got out of bed and went to the window. The light was still on in the Mother Superior's office. She dressed quickly and knocked on the door. "Why, Jenny, what is it?" Sister Maria Baker asked in surprise. "I'll be leaving tomorrow, Sister. I just wanted to let you know. I'm going back to St. John." "But why?" "The location of the U-boat. It just came to me as I was falling asleep." Dillon drove to Mongoose Junction after dinner. He took the holstered Belgian automatic from his jacket pocket. "What on earth is that?" Ferguson demanded. "An ace in the hole. I'll leave it under the dashboard. Looks like a woman's gun to me. And like most women, it gets the job done, Brigadier, so don't be sexist." Dillon clamped the holster onto the dashboard, and they walked into Jenny's place. Captain Siraj, Guerra, and two of the crew from the Maria Blanca were at a booth in the corner. "That's him," Guerra said in Spanish, and they all stopped talking. "Hello there." Mary Jones approached, and Dillon smiled. "We'll join Bob Carney. A bottle of champagne." Carney was just finishing an order of steak and French fries, a beer at his elbow, and looked up as they approached. "This is a friend of mine, Brigadier Charles Ferguson," Dillon told him. "May we join you?" "Sit down." Max Santiago came in, followed by Algaro, and the others stood up. "We've got company," Dillon told Ferguson. The Brigadier looked round. "Oh, dear," he said. Billy Rogers brought a bottle of Pol Roger in a bucket and opened it for them. At that moment they heard a woman's voice say, "Please don't do that." The waitress serving the drinks at Santiago's table was a small blonde girl, rather pretty. She was very young, very vulnerable. Algaro was running his hand over her buttocks and started to move down her leg. "I hate to see that," Carney said, and his face was hard. Dillon said, "I couldn't agree with you more. To say he's in from the stables would be an insult to horses." The girl pulled away. Santiago smiled, turned and whispered to Algaro, who nodded and got to his feet. He sat on a bar stool, and as the girl passed, he put an arm around her waist and whispered in her ear. She went red in the face, close to tears. "Leave me alone," she said. Carney got to his feet, picked up his glass, and walked to the bar. He eased the girl away, then he poured what was left of his beer into Algaro's crotch. "Excuse me," he said. "I didn't see you there," and he turned and walked back to the table. Everyone stopped talking, and Dillon took the bottle from the ice bucket and refilled the brigadier's glass. Algaro stood up and looked down at his trousers in disbelief. "Why, you little creep, I'm going to break your arm for that." He moved to the table fast, and Carney turned to defend himself, but it was Dillon who struck first, reversed his grip on the champagne bottle, and smashed it across the side of Algaro's skull, not once, but twice, the bottle splintering, champagne going everywhere. Algaro pulled himself up, and Dillon, still seated, kicked sideways at the kneecap. Algaro cried out and fell to one side. The other members of the crew of the Maria Blanca were on their feet, but Santiago said in Spanish, "No trouble. Just get him and leave." They helped Algaro to his feet and left. "I'm getting too old for this kind of excitement," Carney said. "I'm going home to bed." He started towards the door, and Dillon called, "I'd like to dive in the morning. Does that suit you?" 9:30, Carney told him, and he turned and went out. He walked to his jeep thinking about what had happened when a hand grabbed his shoulder and Guerra punched him in the mouth. "Now then, you bastard, let's teach you some manners." Serra stood a yard away supporting Algaro, Santiago beside them. Guerra and the other two crew members moved in fast. They held Carney down, pinning his arms, and Algaro shuffled over. "Now then," he said. It was at that precise moment that Dillon and Ferguson turned the corner. As Algaro raised a foot to stamp down on Carney's face, Dillon sent him staggering and punched the nearest man sideways in the jaw. Carney was already on his feet. Dillon and Carney had the jeep at their backs, arms raised, prepared to defend themselves. There was a sudden shot. Everyone stopped dead, turned, and found Ferguson standing beside Dillon's jeep, holding the Belgian automatic in his hand. "Now, do let's stop playing silly buggers, shall we?" There was a pause, and Santiago said in Spanish, "Back to the launch." The crew shuffled away. "Another time, Brigadier," Santiago said in English, and followed them. Carney wiped a little blood from his mouth. "Would somebody kindly tell me what in the hell is going on?" "Yes, we do need to talk, Captain Carney," Ferguson said briskly. "Okay," Carney smiled bleakly. "Follow me and we'll go back to my place." Carney said, "It's the damnedest thing I ever heard of." "But you accept it's true?" Ferguson asked. "The U-boat thing is perfectly possible," Carney said. "They were in these waters during World War II, and that's a known fact." "But where would it be?" Dillon said. "It wouldn't be anywhere usual. I'll tell you something else. It would have to be within 100 feet. Henry was a recreational diver. That means no decompression is necessary if you follow the tables. I'd say 30 minutes bottom time, so his depth would be 80 feet or so. Now, dive masters take tourists to that kind of depth all the time. That's why I mean the location has got to be quite out of the ordinary." Ferguson said, "You must have some idea." Carney frowned. "Well, there's always French Cap and South Drop." "Could we take a look?" Ferguson asked. Carney shook his head and examined the chart again. "I don't know. Strictly speaking, this thing is in the United States territorial waters." "Just listen, please," Ferguson said. "We're not doing anything wicked here. All we want to do is recover some documents as quickly as possible and no harm done." "And Santiago, where does he fit in?" He's obviously after the same thing," Ferguson said. "Why, I don't know." "Santiago and his bunch are the bad guys," Dillon said. "Black hats." "And I'm a good guy?" Carney laughed. "Get the hell out and I'll see you at 9. It was a beautiful morning when Dillon and Ferguson went down to the dock. "Morning!" Carney called as he came towards them. You a good sailor, Brigadier? My dear chap, I've just called in at the gift shop to obtain some seasickness pills, of which I have taken not one, but two. As they eased away from the dock, Dillon went into the deck-house. He had put his diving gear into a hold-all. Underneath was the AK assault rifle and his Belgian automatic. I presume you anticipate our friends from the Maria Blanco following? Ferguson asked. I've been looking, but I haven't seen anything, said Carney. Now I find that strange, Ferguson observed. The water heaved in heavy long swells as they drifted into French Cap Quay. The visibility here is incredible, Carney said. You'll not find better anywhere. That's why I don't believe this is the right spot. The U-boat had been spotted before now. By the way, I think you picked up my diving gloves by mistake. He rummaged in Dillon's hold-all and found the rifle. Dear God, he said, taking it out. What's this? Insurance, Dillon said, as he finished getting his diving gear on, inserted his mouthpiece, and tumbled backwards. Syrah watched from about a quarter of a mile away through a pair of binoculars. Naval and Pinto stood ready in their diving suits. They've anchored, and Dillon and Carney have gone down. There's just the Brigadier on deck, Syrah said. What do you want us to do? Naval asked. We'll go in very fast, but I won't anchor. We'll make it a drift dive and catch them by surprise. Dillon and Carney hung suspended. The visibility was incredible. The water tinged a deep blue stretching into a kind of infinity. But no question that the U-boat could be on a site like this. Then the American gestured forward and led the way back to the anchor line. They paused there and looked up and saw the keel of the launch moving in a wide circle. Carney started up the line and Dillon followed him, finally surfacing at the stern. When did they arrive? Dillon asked Ferguson as he shrugged off his jacket and tank. About 10 minutes after you went down. Roared up at a hell of a speed. They do a neat job of trailing us, I'll say that, Carney said. Haul up the anchor. Stuck fast, Dillon said. Okay, one of us will have to go down and pull it free. Well, that's me, obviously. Dillon picked up his jacket and tank. We need you to handle the boat. Your turn, Brigadier, Carney said. Haul up the anchor the moment it's free. One thing, Dillon, Carney called. There's a 1 or 2 knot current, so you'll probably surface well away from the boat. Just inflate your jacket, and I'll come and get you. As Dillon went off the stern, Algaro said, What's happening? Probably the anchor got stuck, Naval said. Dillon had, in fact, reached it at that precise moment. He pulled the anchor free, and it started up. He tried to follow, was aware of the current, and simply drifted up slowly and resurfaced. He was perhaps 50 yards away from Sea Raider, and inflated his jacket, lifted high on the heavy swell. Naval was the first to spot Dillon. There he is. Wonderful. Algaro shouldered Syrah aside and took over the wheel. I'll show him. He gunned the engine, and the launch bore down on Dillon, who frantically swam to one side, just managing to avoid it. Carney cried out a warning, swinging Sea Raider around from the prow. Ferguson almost falling into the sea. The launch swerved in again, brushing him to one side. Algaro was laughing like a maniac, turning in a wide circle to come in again. The Brigadier had the AK out when Carney came down the ladder, his hands sliding on the guardrails. I know how those things work. You don't, Brigadier. He put it on full automatic, fired a burst over the launch. Syrah was wrestling with Algaro, and Naval and Pinto had hit the deck. Carney fired another careful burst that ripped up some decking. By that time, Syrah had taken over the wheel. He turned and took off at full speed. Ferguson surveyed the area anxiously. Has he gone? Dillon surfaced some little distance away, and Carney took the boat towards him. "Jesus, but that was lively," Dillon said when he reached the deck. He looked up at Carney. "I thought I heard a little gunfire. You?" "Oh, they made me mad," Carney said. "You still want to try South Drop?" "Why not?" Ferguson said, looking at the dwindling launch. "I don't think they'll be bothering us again." The launch slowed a half-mile away, and Sirrah raised the glasses to his eyes and watched the Sea Raider disappear into the curtain of rain and mist. He checked the screen. "They're moving south." "Where are they going? Any ideas?" Algaro asked. Sirrah checked the map in the dive site handbook. "The only one further out is called South Drop. Here we are. It sounds a good dive except for one thing. Black-tip reef sharks." "Are they dangerous?" Algaro demanded. "Depends. If they get stirred up, they can be a real threat." Algaro's smile was unholy. "Have we still got any of that filthy stuff left from fishing yesterday?" he asked Noval. "You mean the bait?" Pinto found a large plastic bucket and took the lid off. The smell was appalling. There were all kinds of cut-up fish in there, mingled with intestines, rotting meat, and oil. "That would bring the sharks in from miles around. This is what we do." Algaro turned to Sirrah. "Once they've stopped, we close in through the fog nice and quiet. We wait. We give them time to go down. Then we go in very fast. Dump this over the side and get the hell out." There was a smile of pure joy on his face. "With any kind of luck, Dillon could lose a leg." The Sea Raider was at anchor. Ferguson sat in the deck-house watching. Carney opened the deck locker and took out a long tube with a handle at one end. "Is that what they call an underwater spear gun?" Ferguson asked. "No, it's a power gun. There's a firing pin at the base." Dillon pulled on his jacket and tank. "You going fishing this time?" "Not exactly. When I was out here last time, there were reef sharks about, and one of them got kind of heavy. I'm just being careful." Dillon went in first, and Carney followed, the powerhead in his left hand. The water was gin clear, and Dillon could see an eagle ray passing in slow motion in the distance, and suddenly a reef shark crossed its path. Carney turned, made a dismissive gesture, and Dillon followed him. Ferguson seemed to hear something and stood listening. There was a sudden roar as Sirrah pushed his engine up to full speed. Ferguson swore and started for the AK. He was aware that the men on the launch were emptying a bucket into the water. By the time he had the AK out, they were gone. Dillon saw something overhead, glanced up and saw the keel of the launch moving fast, and then there was bait drifting down. He hovered there watching, as the barracuda went in like lightning, tearing at a piece of meat. He was aware of a tug at his ankle, glanced down and saw Carney gesturing for him to descend. The American was flat on the bottom when Dillon reached him, and above them there was a sudden turbulence in the water as a shark went in like a torpedo. Dillon lay on his back like Carney, looking up as another shark swerved in, jaws open. A third flashed overhead. One of them snapped at the barracuda, taking its entire body, leaving only the head to float down. Carney turned to Dillon, pointed to the anchor line, motioned to keep low, and led the way. Dillon followed. But something knocked him to one side with tremendous force. One of the sharks. It turned and started in again, and Carney jabbed the powerhead. There was an explosion. The shark twisted away, leaving a trail of blood. The other two sharks circled it, then went in, jaws open. Carney tugged at Dillon's arm and started up the line. Dillon surfaced at the dive platform beside Carney and pulled himself aboard, tank and all. "By the time I got the AK, they were away," Ferguson said. Carney said, "I'd sure like to know how they managed to follow us through this rain and mist." Dillon said, "I should have told you, Brigadier. I have my ace in the hall stored under here." He ran his hand under the instrument panel to find it, and his fingers brushed against the bug. He detached it and held it out to Ferguson in the palm of his hand. "We've been bugged, old son. No wonder they were able to keep track of us so easily." Carney shook his head. "You know, I'm really going to have to do something about these people." The launch pulled in beside the Maria Blanco, and Syrah and Algaro went up the ladder and found Santiago in the stern. Algaro related the morning's events. When he finished, Santiago shook his head. "I doubt whether Dillon sustained any lasting damage. We're wasting our time. There's nothing to be done until the girl arrives. We'll run over to Samson Key. I'm tired of this place." At that moment, Syrah handed Santiago the portable phone. "A call from London, senor." "Francis," Santiago said, "how are you? I was wondering if you had had any breakthrough yet." "No, but there's no need to worry. Everything is under control. One thing has just occurred to me. The caretakers of the old hotel at the Samson Key during the war, they were a black couple from Tortola, May and Joseph Jackson. She died years ago, but he's still around. About 72, I think. Last time I saw him, he was running a taxi on the quay." "I'll attend to it." Santiago put the phone down and turned to Algaro. "Another job for you? But there's no rush." Later in the afternoon, Dillon was lying on a lounge on the terrace when Ferguson appeared. "I've just had a thought," the Brigadier said. "The millionaire's retreat at Samson Key. Might be rather fun to have dinner there. Beard the lion in his own den." "Sounds good to me," Dillon said. "We could fly over if you like. Perhaps we can persuade Carney to join us. Tell him to meet us at Jenny's place at 6 in his best bib and tucker. We'll have a cocktail and wing our way to Samson Key. Should be a jolly evening," he said, and went out. In blazer and guard's tie, the Panama at a suitable angle, the Brigadier looked extremely impressive. Dillon wore a navy blue silk suit, a white cotton shirt buttoned at the neck. When they entered Jenny's place, Bob Carney leaned on the bar, wearing white linen slacks and a blue shirt, a blazer on the stool. He turned and whistled. "A regular fashion parade. Thank God I dressed." "Well, we are meeting the devil face to face, in a manner of speaking," Ferguson said to Billy. "Champagne, innkeeper." "I thought that might be what you'd want. Now, the surprise I've been saving." "And what's that?" said Carney. "Miss Jenny was on the phone from Paris, France. She's coming home. Should be here right about this time tomorrow." Billy filled 3 glasses. "And she gave me a special message for you, Mr. Dillon. She said to tell you she's coming back because she thinks she might know where it is. Does that make any sense?" "All the sense in the world." Ferguson raised his glass. Behind them, the bearded fisherman, who had been sitting at the end of the bar listening, got up and left. He went to a public phone along the waterfront, took out a piece of paper Syrah had given him, and rang the Maria Blanco. Ferguson, Dillon, and Carney reached the Cessna and strapped themselves in. Dillon released the brakes, and the plane rolled down the ramp into the water and drifted out. He switched on. The engine coughed into life, the propeller turned. He taxied out of the harbor and turned into the wind. They drifted up into the air and started to climb. Exactly 15 minutes after leaving Cruz Bay, he was making his first pass over the island. Dillon put the Cessna down for a perfect landing, taxied towards the end of the airstrip, and switched off. They all got out, and Joseph Jackson came to meet them. "Car waiting over here, gents. I'll take you down to the restaurant. Joseph's the name, Joseph Jackson. Anything you want, just let me know. I've been around this island longer than anybody." "Indeed," said Ferguson. "I don't suppose you were here in the war. I understand it was unoccupied." "That ain't so," Jackson said. "There was an old hotel here. Belonged to an American family, the Herberts. During the war, me and my wife May came over from Tortola to look after things." They'd reached the station wagon, and Ferguson said, "Herbert, you say they were the owners?" "Miss Herbert's father, he gave it to her as a wedding present. Then she married a Mr. Vale. Then she had a daughter, only Miss Vale then became Lady Paymer. What do you think of that? A real English lady, just like the movies." "Switch off that engine," Ferguson ordered. Jackson looked bewildered. "Did I say something?" Ferguson said, "Miss Vale became Lady Paymer, you're sure?" "I knew it, didn't I? She came here at the end of the war with her baby, little Francis. That must have been April 1945. There was a heavy silence. Dillon said, "Was anyone else here at the time?" "German gent named Strasser. He just turned up one night, but Lady Paymer was expecting him." "And Sir Joseph?" "He came over from England in June. Mr. Strasser, he moved on. The Paymers went back to England after that. Sir Joseph, he used to come back, but that was years ago when the resort was first built." "And Sir Francis Paymer?" "Little Francis?" Jackson laughed. "I've seen him many times. Can we go now, gents?" "Of course," Ferguson said. No one said a word until they reached the front entrance. Ferguson produced his wallet, extracted a 10-pound note, and passed it to Jackson. "My thanks." "And I thank you," Jackson told him. "I'll be ready for you when you want to go back." The three of them paused at the bottom of the steps. Dillon said, "So now we know how Santiago comes to be so well informed." "God in heaven," Ferguson said. "A minister of the Crown and one of the oldest families in England." The manager, Carlos Prieto, appeared at the top of the steps. "Brigadier Ferguson, what a pleasure. Senor Santiago is waiting for you at the bar. He's just come over from the Maria Blanco. He prefers to stay on board while he's here." The lounge bar was busy with the rich. People tended to be older rather than younger, the men especially, mostly American, being rather obviously close to the end of their working lives. Santiago, who was seated in a booth by the bar with Algaro, stood up and reached out a hand urbanely. "My dear Brigadier Ferguson, such a pleasure." "Senor Santiago," Ferguson said formally, "I've been looking forward to this meeting." He pointed briefly at Algaro. "But do we really have to have this creature present? I mean, couldn't he go and feed the fish or something?" Algaro looked as if he would have liked to kill him on the spot, but Santiago laughed out loud. "Poor Algaro! An acquired taste, I fear." Algaro went out, and Ferguson said, "So here we are. What now?" "A little champagne, perhaps, a pleasant dinner?" The waiter filled the glasses, and Santiago continued, "Let's lay our cards on the table, Brigadier. We both want the same thing. Bormann's briefcase. You don't want the contents to fall into the wrong hands, the old scandal affecting so many people. I don't want all that to come out either." "So the work continues," Ferguson said. "The Kameraden. How many names are on that list? Famous names, old names, who have prospered since the war in industry and business, all on the back of Nazi money. "Come now," said Santiago. "Is any of this important after all these years?" "But it is important," Ferguson said. "That's the point. If the network continues over the years, if sons become involved, grandsons, imagine, for example, having someone high in government, how useful that would be, and then, after so many years, the kind of scandal that could bring down everything around your ears." Santiago waved for the waiter to pour more champagne. "I thought you might be sensible, but I see this is not getting us anywhere." He stood up. "At least we can eat like civilized men. Please, gentlemen, join me." The Ford station wagon slowed to a halt at the side of the airstrip, Algaro sitting in the rear behind Joseph Jackson. "Is this where you wanted, mister?" "I guess so," Algaro said. "The people you brought in from the plane, were they curious? Did they ask questions?" Jackson began to feel uncomfortable. "Well, the English gentleman, he was interested in the old days. I told him how I was caretaker here during the big war with my wife." "And what else did you tell him?" Algaro put a hand on the back of his neck. "Tell me, damn you!" "It was nothing much, mister." Jackson struggled to get away. "About the Paymers." "The Paymers? Tell me everything. Just tell the truth." Which Jackson did. And when he was finished, Algaro said, "There. That wasn't too bad, was it?" He slid an arm across Jackson's throat, put his other hand on top of his head and twisted, breaking his neck so cleanly that the old man was dead in a second. The meal was excellent. West Indian chicken wings with blue cheese, conch chowder, followed by baked red snapper. Algaro appeared in the doorway. "You must excuse me, gentlemen." Santiago got up and joined Algaro. "What is it?" "I found out who the Jackson man was. The old fool driving the Ford taxi." Algaro told Santiago briefly, and Santiago listened intently. "But it means our friends now know that Sir Francis is involved." "It doesn't make any difference, senor. We know the girl is returning tomorrow. She thinks she knows where the U-boat is. Who needs these people anymore?" "Algaro," Santiago asked, "what have you done?" As Santiago returned to the table, Ferguson finished his tea and stood up. "Excellent dinner, Santiago, but we really must be going." "What a pity. It's been quite an experience." "Hasn't it? By the way, a couple of presents for you." Ferguson took the 2 tracking bugs from his pocket and put them on the table. "Yours, I think. Give my regards to Sir Francis next time you're in touch." "How well you put it," Santiago said, and sat down. They reached the front entrance to find Prieto standing at the top of the steps. "I'm so sorry, gentlemen, but I've no idea what's happened to the taxi." "It's of no consequence," Ferguson said. "We can walk there in 5 minutes. Good night." It was Carney who noticed the station wagon just as they reached the airstrip. They walked across and saw the body at once. "The poor bastard," Carney said. Dillon said, "He tells us all about Francis Paymer. And bingo, he's dead." "Now let's get out of here," Ferguson said. He and Carney got into the rear seats of the plane. Dillon got a torch from the map compartment and did an external inspection. "Everything looks all right." He then climbed into the pilot's seat. "I don't think he wants to kill us yet," Ferguson said. "He still needs us to lead him to the U-boat." Dillon took the Cessna down the runway and lifted into the night, turning out to sea. They moved along the southern coast. And then it happened. The engine missed a beat, coughed, and sputtered. Dillon checked the instruments and saw what had happened to the oil pressure. "We've got problems. Get your life jackets on." "But surely the whole point of these things is that you don't have to crash, you can land on the sea," Ferguson said. "That is the theory," Dillon told him, and the engine died totally and the propeller stopped. They were at 900 feet, and he took the plane down in a steep dive. "Reef Bay dead ahead," said Carney. "Right now, this is how it goes," Dillon told them. "If we're lucky, we'll simply glide down and land on the water. If the waves are too much, we might start to tip, so bail out straight away. There's the third alternative, and that's going straight under." "You've just made my night," Ferguson told him. "Right, here we go." Dillon dropped the Cessna in for what seemed like a perfect landing, and something went wrong straight away. The plane lurched forward, then tipped and plunged beneath the surface, nose down. The water was like black glass. They were already totally submerged and descending, still plenty of air in the cabin. Dillon felt the water rising up over his ankles, and suddenly it was waist-deep. "Be ready to go any second now." The Cessna touched bottom, lifted a little, then settled to one side. Carney said, "Big breath, Brigadier. I'm opening the door now. Just slide out through and we'll go up together." Dillon took a deep breath himself, and as the water passed over his head, opened his door, pulled himself out and started up. Then he broke through the surface and took a deep lungful of air. Carney and Ferguson floated a few yards away. Dillon swam towards them. "Are you all right?" "Dillon!" Ferguson was gasping for breath. "I owe you dinner. I owe you both dinner." "I'll hold you to that. You can take me to the Garrick again." They turned and swam towards the beach, Carney and Dillon on either side of the older man. They staggered out of the water together and sat on the sand recovering. Carney said, "There's a house not too far from here. I know the people well. They'll run us into town." "And the plane?" Dillon asked. "There's a good salvage outfit in St. Thomas." Back at the cottage at Kinneil, Ferguson dialed the number of Detective Inspector Jack Lane's flat. "Jack, I've discovered how our friend Santiago has managed to stay so well informed. Would you believe Sir Francis Paymer?" "Good God," Lane sat up. "Anyway, give the Paymer family the works, Jack. Where did old Joseph's money come from? How does Sir Francis manage to live like a prince? Use all the usual sources." Then Ferguson punched the numbers on the cellular phone again. "Mr. Prieto, Charles Ferguson calling from Kinneil. Wonderful evening. Do thank Mr. Santiago for me." Paymer sounded rather irritated when he came to the phone. There was a pause, and he said, "Oh, it's you, Max. How are things?" "We succeeded in locating the old man you mentioned, Jackson. What a mind! Remembered everything about 1945 in the sharpest detail." "Oh, my God," said Paymer. "Luckily for you, he had an accident." "Please, Max, I don't want to know this." "Don't be silly, Francis. This is hold on to your nerves time, particularly as the old boy told everything he knew to Ferguson before my man helped him on his way. Unfortunate, that." "Ferguson knows?" Paymer felt as if he were about to choke and tore at his tie. "I'm afraid so. What are we going to do?" "Get rid of Ferguson, obviously, and Dillon as well as Carney. The girl arrives this evening, and my information is that she knows where the U-boat is. She'll be of no further use after that, of course. My secretary told me she'd noticed a trace being run through the computer. I didn't think anything of it. I mean, when you're a minister, they keep these various checks going for your own protection." "Right," Santiago said. "Have the source checked at once and report back to me." When Paymer called back, he said, "It couldn't be worse. The computer trace has been authorized by Detective Inspector Lane, Ferguson's assistant." "Just stay cool. Think of the time scale. Ferguson can only have had time to speak to this Lane. If he had spoken to Simon Carter, you'd know by now. Ferguson's playing this whole thing very close to his chest, and that's the way he'll continue." "But what about Lane?" "I'll have him taken care of." "I can't take any more killing," Paymer moaned. "Do try to act like a man occasionally," Santiago said. He replaced the phone, thought about it, then dialed a London number. He spoke in Spanish. "Santiago, I have a major elimination which must be carried out tonight." Dillon was swimming off Paradise Beach when he heard the cellular phone and swam in as fast as he could. "Dillon here. It's Jenny. Where are you?" "I'm at the bar. I just got in. How have things been?" "Well, let's say it's been lively and leave it at that. Do you really think you can help, Jenny?" "Well, it's just an idea so simple that I'm afraid to tell you, so let's leave it until we meet. Let's meet here at 7:30, and bring Bob." At the Ministry of Defence, just before midnight, Jack Lane finished his preliminary reading concerning the Paymer family. He had done enough for one night. He got his raincoat, switched off the lights, and left. He came out and walked along the pavement. The young man sitting behind the wheel of the stolen Jaguar started the engine, watched Lane cross the road. Lane was aware of the Jaguar, but had plenty of time to cross. There was a sudden roar of the engine. He half-turned, too late. The Jaguar hit him with such force that he was flung violently to one side. Lane lay there trying to push himself up, and was aware that the Jaguar was reversing. The rear bumper fractured his skull, killing him instantly, and the car bumped over his body. It was almost dark when Bob Carney went into Jenny's place and found Dillon, Ferguson, and Jenny. "I think I know where the information may be found, but it's so absurdly simple." She took a deep breath and turned to Carney. "Bob, the Rhoda is still moored there in the harbour. Will you take us there?" "Sure, Jenny." Algaro and Guerra watched the group descend to an inflatable. Carney sat in the stern, started the outboard, and they moved out into the harbour. Carney switched on the light in the deck-house, and they all crowded in. "Well, Miss Grant," Ferguson said, "what have you got to tell us?" "Henry was meticulous about keeping a log," she said. "He usually kept it in here." She opened the small locker by the wheel, reached inside, and found it at once. She held it out to Dillon. "You read it." Dillon turned the pages, then read the last one. "It says he made an 80 to 90-foot dive at a place called Thunder Point. His final entry reads, horse-eyed jacks in quantity, yellow-tailed snappers, and one Type 7 German submarine." "Thank God," Jenny Grant said. "I was right." There was a profound silence as Dillon closed the log, and Ferguson said, "And now I really could do with a drink." Algaro and Guerra watched them return. Algaro said, "I'm sure she's told them something. You stay here and keep an eye on things while I go and report in." Inside Jenny's place, Dillon said to Carney, "You seemed surprised about the location, this Thunder Point. Why?" "No one dives there. It's the most dangerous reef in this part of the world. But that morning after the hurricane, the sea was calmer than I've ever seen it." "So, when do we go?" Ferguson demanded. Carney said, "The way I see it, we want to be in and out before Santiago even knows what's going on. They can't track us any longer, so we could capitalize on that by leaving around midnight, making the trip under cover of darkness. We could go down at first light. Sounds good to me, Dillon said. Now we eat, Ferguson said. All this excitement has given me quite an appetite. They'd dined well when Dillon's cellular phone rang. He handed it across to Ferguson. It's for you, somebody from Special Branch in London. The brigadier took the phone. He listened, and suddenly turned very pale and his shoulders sagged. Excuse me. He went out. Ferguson returned after a moment and sat down. Jack, Lane, my assistant, is dead. Oh, no, Jenny said. Hit-and-run accident around midnight. He'd been working late. You tell him to check up on Paymer, and in no time he's lying dead in a London side street, Dillon said. It was the first time he had seen real anger in Ferguson's face. That hadn't escaped me, Dillon. The bill will be paid in full, believe me. He took a deep breath and stood up. Right, let's get going. Are you coming, my dear? I don't think so, Jenny told him, but I'll come and see you off. Carney had brought the Sea Raider to the end of the dock at Kinneil. Dillon took the Belgian automatic out of his pocket. Put that in your purse, Jenny. Just pull the slider, point and fire. She took it reluctantly. You think this is necessary? You never can tell. Santiago's been ahead of us too many times. When you get back, you'll find that Billy and Mary intend to stay the night with you. You think of everything, don't you? I try to. He stepped on board. Cast off for us, Jenny, Carney said. Take care, my dear, Ferguson called. She raised an arm as Sea Raider moved out to sea. Then she turned and walked away. Algaro and Guerra had watched the departure from the shadows, and now they followed her. She's bound to go home, Algaro said. That's the best place to deal with her. Jenny was at the house in 5 minutes. She went up the steps, then locked the door behind her. She mounted the stairs wearily, opened her bedroom door and switched on the light. She stood at the open French windows for a moment enjoying the coolness, then turned and found Algaro and Guerra standing just inside the room. It was just as if she was dreaming, but that terrible face told her otherwise. Jenny surprised herself by darting forward and around them to the door. She almost made it, but Guerra caught her right wrist and swung her round. Algaro struck her heavily across the face and hurled her back on the bed. She tried to pull the gun from her purse. He took it from her, turned her on her face, pulling her left arm up, twisted and applied some leverage. The pain was terrible, and she cried out. You like that, eh? Algaro was enjoying himself. Let's try some more. The pain was the worst she'd ever known, and she screamed. He turned her over and took a knife from his pocket. She saw it was razor sharp. He stroked the blade across her cheek and pricked it with the needle point so that the blood came. She was terrified out of her mind. Anything, she pleaded. Right. Where would we find the wreck of the U-180? Thunder Point, she gasped. And where would that be? It's about 10 or 12 miles south of St. John. Dillon, the Brigadier, and Carney, they've gone to Thunder Point? Yes. They're diving at first light. He patted her face, closed the knife, and looked at Guerra. Lock the door. Algaro turned, and his smile was the cruelest thing Jenny had ever seen. You did say you'd do anything, and he started to take off his jacket. She screamed again, totally hysterical now, jumped to her feet and ran headlong through the open French windows onto the balcony, hit the railings and went over, plunging through the heavy rain to the garden below. It was only 5 minutes later that Billy and Mary Jones turned into the drive and found her at once. Mary said, "Thank God she's alive. You carry her inside and I'll phone for the doctor." And she ran up the steps to the house. Santiago put the phone down and turned to Sarah. "Dillon and company are on their way to Thunder Point now. They intend to dive at first light. Is there any way we could beat them to it?" "I doubt it, senor. And they'd see the Maria Blanco coming for miles." Santiago examined the chart again and nodded. "I think we'll let them do all the work for us. They'll sail back to St. John happy because they will think they have won the game. We'll descend on them when they return." "It's maybe time we discussed how we're going to do this thing," Carney said to Dillon. "For a no-compression dive at 80 feet, we're good for 40 minutes. So we're going to have to find that submarine fast and lay the charge on the first dive down. If we had luck, went straight down, got in the control room and laid that Semtex, we could be in like Flynn and out and be back on top in 20 minutes. "That would make a big difference to the second dive," Dillon said. "It surely would." Carney glanced at his watch. "Time to get moving, gents." He took off his jeans and T-shirt. "This water is so clear I'm going to go trolling. That means I'll stay at less than 10 feet. If I'm lucky, I might manage to pinpoint the U-boat." He zipped up his diving suit and went over backwards. Carney surfaced 100 yards away and waved his arms. "Drop the hook here." Carney swam around to the dive platform, slipped off his jacket and climbed aboard. "Clearest I've ever seen," he said. "We're right on the edge of the cliff. I swear I can see something sticking out over a ledge. Now let's see what you've got in the bag, Dillon." Dillon produced the Semtex and a 10-minute fuse. "I'm ready when you are." The water was astonishingly clear and very blue. The current was so strong that when Dillon held onto the anchor, his body was extended to one side. Dillon followed Carney over the edge of the cliff, looking down into the blue infinity below, and saw the great scar where the coral had broken away and the bulk of the U-180, the prow sticking out from the ledge. They descended to the ragged gash in the hull. Dillon hovered as Carney went inside. He switched his spot lamp on and followed the American. It was dark and gloomy, a confusion of twisted metal. Carney was crouched beside the forward hatch, trying to turn the unlocking wheel with no success. Dillon opened his dive bag, took out the Semtex, and handed some to Carney. They pressed the plastic explosive in place. They finished, and Dillon glanced at his computer. 17 minutes. Carney nodded, and Dillon turned and went out through the rent. Dillon broke through to the surface. "You found it?" Ferguson demanded. "Just like Carney said." Carney was changing tanks for fresh ones. "Sweet Jesus, I've never seen such a sight." The surface of the sea lifted. Spray scattering and foam appeared. They watched until the activity dwindled and went in again. Carney hovered over the edge of the cliff, and when Dillon joined him, he saw the problem at once. The force of the explosion had caused the U-boat to move. The stern had lifted, and the prow, stretching out over that 2,000-foot drop, was already dipping. They held on to the bridge rail, and Dillon could actually feel the boat move. He looked at Carney, and the American shook his head. He was right, of course. Another few feet, and U-180 would slide right over into oblivion, and Dillon couldn't accept that. He pulled free of Carney's restraining hand and headed to the hull, pulling himself into the control room. Everything was stirring, and he was aware of an eerie noise as if some live creature was groaning in pain. Too late to retreat now. He splayed the beam of the torch around and saw it lying in the corner, coated with filth. A metal briefcase, just like the one Baker had taken to London. He ran a hand across it. And then the floor tilted at an alarming angle. He grabbed the case and started through the hatch. His jacket snagged, and he struggled frantically, aware of the boat tilting further. And then Carney released him. The American turned and made for the gash in the hull, and Dillon went after him. The whole boat tilting now, and Carney was through, drifting up, and Dillon rose to meet him. As they turned to look down, the great whale-like shape of U-180 slipped over the edge and plunged into the void. As they surfaced, Ferguson leaned over anxiously. "Dear God, I thought the end of the world had come." "That's the last anyone will ever see of the U-180, said Carney. "It's as if she never existed." "Oh, yes, she did," Ferguson said, "and we have this to prove it." He held up the briefcase. The documents were in sealed envelopes. Ferguson opened the first one, took out the letter, and unfolded it. It signed Adolf Hitler. He opened another and took out a bulky file. This must be the Blue Book. "See if Paymer is there." Dillon checked quickly. "Yes, Major." He looked through several more pages. "I know I'm just an Irish peasant, but some of the names in here you wouldn't believe. Some of England's finest, a few of America's also." "Try that," Ferguson said. Dillon took out the letter and unfolded it. "The Windsor Protocol." "My God," said Carney. "If that's genuine, it's dynamite." "Exactly." Ferguson folded the letter. "If it is genuine, the Nazis were past masters at forgery." But his face was sad as he closed the case. "What now?" asked Carney. "We return to St. John, where Dillon and I will make our way back to London. I have the Learjet waiting at St. Thomas." When Sea Raider moved into the dock at Kinneil Bay, the beach was crowded with sun-worshippers. Guerra was one of them. A young black receptionist hurried out to meet the three men. "Oh, Captain Carney, I saw you coming in. There was an urgent message for you from Billy Jones. He said to tell you that Jenny Grant had an accident last night, fell from the balcony. She's there now. They're moving her over to St. Thomas's Hospital real soon." "My God," Carney said. "Another bloody accident," Dillon said bitterly, and handed the hold-all to Ferguson. "I'm going to see her." "Yes, of course, dear boy. I'll go back to the cottage, have a shower, and get packed. I'll see you later." Dillon turned to Carney. "Are you coming?" "I sure as hell am," Carney said, and they hurried off. Ferguson pulled off his sweater. He should have felt exhilarated, but then too much had happened. He took the briefcase from the bed and stood it at the side of the small desk, checked that the front door was locked, then went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Guerra was on the terrace in a matter of seconds. Algaro moved in and took the Browning from him. "In the shower, is he?" Algaro moved quickly to the desk and picked up the briefcase triumphantly. As they turned to go, Ferguson emerged from the bathroom, tying the belt of his robe. He simply flung himself on them. Algaro struck him across the side of the head with the barrel of the Browning, and when Ferguson fell to one knee, stamped him sideways into the wall. Ferguson managed to get to his feet. Dizzy, his head hurting like hell, he staggered to the terrace and saw as Algaro and Guerra pushed an inflatable into the water. It was only then that Ferguson, looking up, realized that the Maria Blanca was anchored off there. He had never felt so impotent, so full of rage. It was Billy who opened the front door to admit Dillon and Bob Carney to the house. "Can she speak?" Dillon asked as they went upstairs. "Came around about an hour ago. It was you she asked for, Mr. Dillon." Dillon took her hand, and she opened her eyes. "Dillon?" "That's right, Johnny." "I'm sorry, Dillon. Sorry I let you down." "You didn't let us down, Jenny. We found the U-boat." "I told him, Dillon. I told him you had gone to Thunder Point." "Told who, Jenny?" "The man with the scar. He hurt me, really hurt me. Nobody ever hurt me like that." And she closed her eyes and drifted off. When Dillon turned, the rage on his face was a living thing. "He's a dead man walking, Algaro, I give you my word." He brushed past Carney and went downstairs. "Does Mac Santiago seem the kind of man who'd just give up at this point?" "No way," Carney said. "Let's get back to Kinneil fast. I'll find Ferguson. We'll meet up at the bar." When Dillon hammered on the door of 7D, it was opened by Ferguson holding ice cubes to his head. "I did my best, Dillon, but the bastard clouded me across the head. They had an inflatable on the beach and took off for Maria Blanco. It was anchored out there." Dillon pulled up the blinds. "Well, it isn't now." In the darkest corner of the bar, Ferguson and Dillon shared a table. Carney came in. "I checked with a friend who went out fishing. They passed Santiago going southeast, which means they must be going to Samson Key." Dillon actually laughed. "Right, you bastard. I've got you now. We'll go in under cover of darkness. I'll get the briefcase back." Sea Raider crept to the west side of Samson Key. Carney switched off the engines, came down the ladder as Dillon went into the prow and dropped the anchor. Ferguson checked his watch. 10 o'clock. Dillon went into the deck-house, took the Walther from the hold-all, put it in the dive bag with the silencer, what was left of the Semtex, the night sight, and a couple of detonating fuses, the 30-minute ones. Carney said, "I'll take you as close as I can." Carney took the inflatable round the point, the outboard motor throttled down, the noise of it a murmur in the night. Maria Blanco was anchored 300 yards out. Carney killed the engine and took a couple of wooden oars from the bottom of the boat. "Manpower the rest of the way. With those other boats around, I can get you maybe 50 yards away without being spotted." Dillon was already wearing his jacket and tank. Guerra and Salona stood at the bottom of the ladder, each armed with an M16 rifle. Algaro stood by the rail. 2 hours on and 4 off. We'll rotate during the night and we'll leave the security lights on." "That seems more than adequate," Santiago said. "We might as well turn in now." He went along to the salon, put the briefcase on the desk, took off his jacket, and went and poured a cognac. Finally, as he knew he would, he opened the briefcase and started to go through the documents again. Dillon focused the night sight. He picked out Salona and Guerra in the shadows. Dillon handed Carney the night sight. "All yours. I'm on my way." He dropped back over the side of the inflatable, descended to 10 feet and approached the ship. He surfaced at the stern of the launch. Suddenly, Salona appeared up above on the platform. Dillon took the Walther from the inside of his jacket and extended his arm. "Over here," he whispered in Spanish. Salona glanced up, and the silenced Walther coughed as Dillon shot him between the eyes. Salona dropped 10 feet into the water. It didn't make too much of a splash, but Guerra got to his feet. "Hey, Salona, is that you?" "Yes," Dillon called softly in Spanish. "No problem." He slipped out of his jacket and tank, clipped them to the anchor line, hauled himself up the chain, sliding in through the port. Algaro, lying on his bunk, had the porthole open and listened. He picked up the revolver on his bedside locker and went out. Guerra called, "Where are you, Solana?" and moved to the forward deck, the M16 ready. "Over here, amigo," Dillon said, and as Guerra turned, he shot him twice in the heart. Dillon went forward cautiously, leaned over to check that he was dead, and he was suddenly aware of the barrel of a revolver against his neck. "Now then, you bastard, I've got you." Algaro reached over and took the walther. He tossed the revolver over the rail into the sea. "Now turn around, I'm going to give you 2 in the belly, so you take a long time." Dillon turned, his left arm sweeping Algaro's right to the side, the walther discharging into the deck. They struggled for a moment, feeling each other's strength. "Why don't you call for help?" "Because I'm going to kill you with my own hands," Algaro told him. Algaro pushed Dillon back against the rail. It was his last mistake, for Dillon let himself go straight over, taking Algaro with him, and the sea was Dillon's territory, not his. As they went under, Dillon held on, pulling him down, aware of the anchor chain against his back. He grabbed for it with one hand and got a forearm across Algaro's throat. At first he struggled very hard, but quickly weakened. Finally, he was still. Dillon, his own lungs nearly bursting, surfaced. It occurred to him that Carney was watching, and he raised an arm, then hauled himself back up the anchor chain. He kept to the shadows, moving along the deck until he got to the salon. Dillon crouched down, thinking, then made his decision. He took the Semtex from his dive bag, inserted 2 30-minute detonator fuses, and dropped it down one of the engine room air vents. Santiago now closed the briefcase, yawned, and went into the bedroom. Dillon opened the salon door, and as he picked up the briefcase, Santiago came back into the room. The cry that erupted from his mouth was like a cry of anguish. "No!" Dillon ran for the door. Santiago got the desk drawer open, grabbed a gun, and fired blindly. Dillon was already making for the deck. Sirrah appeared from his cabin, a gun in his hand. Dillon ran to the stern and jumped over the rail. He went under as deep as he could, but the case made things awkward. He surfaced, aware that they were firing at him. In the end, it was Carney who saved him, roaring out of the night and tossing him a line. "Hang on, and let's get the hell out of here," he called, boosted speed, and took them away into the friendly dark. "Carney's Sea Raider must be nearby," Santiago said, "and the moment they move, you'll see them on your radar. I mean, there's no other boat moving out to sea from Samson Key." "True, senor," said Sirrah. "Then let's get moving." "Don't worry, senor," Sirrah told him. "We're faster than they are. There's no way they can get back to St. John without us overtaking them." Sea Raider ploughed forward into the night. Ferguson sat in the swivel chair, and Dillon leaned against the rail beside Carney. "They're faster than we are. You know that," Carney said. "I know." "Well, I sure as hell can't go any faster." It was Ferguson who saw the Maria Blanco first. Carney said, "No way I can lose him." "Oh, yes, there is," Dillon said. "Just keep going." The explosion, when it came, was instantaneous, tearing the bottom out of the ship. What happened was so catastrophic that neither Santiago, Captain Sirrah, nor the 3 remaining crew members had time to take it in as their world disintegrated, and the Maria Blanco lifted, then plunged beneath the waves. It was just after 10 the following morning when a nurse showed the 3 of them into a private room at the St. Thomas Hospital. Jenny was propped against the pillows, her head swathed in white bandages. She managed a weak smile. "My 3 musketeers. "Now, that's kind of fanciful." Bob Carney took her hand. "How are you?" "I don't feel I'm here half the time." "That'll pass, my dear," Ferguson said. "I've had a word with the superintendent. Any treatment you need, you get. It's all taken care of." "Thank you, Brigadier." She turned to Dillon, looked at him without speaking. Bob Carney said, "I'll be back, honey. You take care." He turned to Ferguson, who nodded, and they went out. Dillon sat on the bed. "You look terrible." "I know." "How did it all go?" "We've got the Bormann briefcase. The Brigadier has his Learjet waiting. We're taking it back to London." "The way you put it, you make it sound as if it was easy." "Santiago and his friends, that animal Algaro, they'll never bother you again." "Can you be certain of that?" "As a coffin lid closing," he said bleakly. There was a kind of pain on her face. "People don't really change, do they?" "I am what I am, Jenny," he said simply. "But then you knew that." He kissed her hand, got up, went to the door and opened it. "Dillon," she called. "God bless, and take care of yourself." The door closed softly. She closed her eyes and drifted into sleep. They allowed Carney to walk out across the tarmac to the Lear with them. The Brigadier held up the briefcase. "Thanks for this, Captain Carney. If you ever need any help or I can do you a good turn." He shook hands and went up the steps. Carney said, "What happens now?" "That's up to the Prime Minister," Dillon said. "This Paymer guy, what about him?" "I hadn't really thought about it." "Oh, yes, you have." Carney shook his head. "God help you, Dillon, because you'll never change." And he turned and walked away. It was just before 6 o'clock the following evening in Ferguson's office, and Simon Carter sat white-faced and shaken as Ferguson finished talking. "So, what's to be done about good Sir Francis?" Carter picked up the Blue Book file, hesitated, put it down, and unfolded the Windsor Protocol to read it again. "I just can't believe this is genuine." "Perhaps not, but the rest of it is." Ferguson reached across for the documents, replaced them in the briefcase, and closed it. "The Prime Minister will see us at 8. I'll meet you there." It was 10 minutes later, and Sir Francis Paymer was clearing his desk at the House of Commons before leaving when the phone went. "Paymer here." "Max Santiago is dead," Ferguson said, "and I have the Blue Book. Your father, you'll be interested to know, is featured prominently on page 18. "Oh, dear God." Paymer slumped into his chair. Ferguson said, "You know Charing Cross Pier?" "Of course." "One of the riverboats, the Queen of Denmark, leaves there at 6:45. I'll meet you on board." When Paymer arrived at Charing Cross Pier, the fog was so thick that he could hardly see across the Thames. He bought his ticket. There were few passengers. He went out on deck, opening his umbrella against the driving rain. There was someone standing at the rail, also holding an umbrella. "That you, Ferguson?" He went forward hesitantly, his hand on the butt of the pistol in his right-hand raincoat pocket. Ferguson turned from the rail. "Ah, there you are." He held up the briefcase. "Well, there it is. The Prime Minister is having a look at 8 o'clock. please, Ferguson. Don't do this to me. It's not my fault that my father was a fascist. Quite right. It's also not your fault that your father's immense fortune came from his association with the Nazi movement. I can even excuse a simple weakness of character, the way you've been happy to accept a continuing income from the drug business. Now look here, Paymer began. Don't bother to deny it. I'd asked Jack Lane to investigate your family's financial background, not realizing I was sentencing him to death. He left his findings in his desk. It wasn't my fault, any of it, Paymer said wildly. Oh, yes, Ferguson conceded. What I can't forgive is the fact that you acted as Santiago's lapdog from the very beginning. It was your actions that resulted in Jenny Grant being severely injured. I knew none of this, I swear. Oh, everything was arranged by Santiago, I grant you that. What I'm talking about is responsibility. A poor old man called Joseph Jackson brutally murdered. And Jack Lane. Paymer took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. As regards my family's business interests, that was my father's affair, not mine. I'll plead ignorance. I know the law, Ferguson, and you seem to have forgotten that I was a working barrister for a short while. Actually, I had, Ferguson said. Santiago being dead, the only thing you have left is my father's inclusion in the Blue Book. Hardly my fault. He seemed to have recovered his nerve. You can't prove a thing. I'll tough it out. Ferguson turned and looked at the river. Goodbye, Sir Francis, he said, and walked away. Paymer was trembling, and he had totally forgotten about the Volker pistol in his pocket. Too late now for any wild ideas like relieving Ferguson of the briefcase at gunpoint. He fumbled for his cigarette case, got one to his mouth and tried to find his lighter. Then there was the softest of footfalls, and Dillon's Zippo flared. There you go. Paymer's eyes widened with fear. Dillon, what do you want? A word only. Dillon put his right arm around Paymer's shoulders. The first time I met you on the terrace at the House of Commons, I made a joke about security, and you said you couldn't swim. Is that true? Well, yes. Paymer's eyes widened as he understood. He pulled the Volker from his raincoat pocket, but Dillon swept the arm wide. The weapon gave a muted cough. The bullet thudded into the bulkhead. The Irishman slammed his right wrist on the rail so that the pistol dropped into the river. Thanks, old son, Dillon said. You've just made it easier for me. He swung Paymer around and pushed hard between the shoulder blades so that he sagged across the stern rail, reached down, grabbed him by the ankles and heaved him over. The umbrella floated upside down. There was a strangled cry as he went under, and the fog swirled across the surface of the Thames, covering everything. 5 minutes later, the Queen of Denmark pulled in at Westminster Pier next to the bridge. Taken care of? I think you could say that, Dillon said to Ferguson. Good. I've got an appointment at Downing Street now. I'll see you at my flat. Let you know what happened. Ferguson was admitted to Downing Street 15 minutes early for his appointment. One of the Prime Minister's aides said, the PM would welcome the opportunity to consider the material in question. He won't keep you long. A few moments later, Simon Carter was admitted. Brigadier, Carter said formally. The Prime Minister sat at his desk, the briefcase open at one side. He was reading through the Blue Book and glanced up briefly. Sit down, gentlemen. He sat back and looked at them. Some of the names in this Blue Book list are really quite incredible, Sir Joseph Paymer, for example. I presume that is why you didn't ask Sir Francis to join us, Brigadier. I felt his presence would be inappropriate, and Sir Francis agreed. Carter turned and glanced at him sharply. The Prime Minister said, "You have informed him of his father's presence in the Blue Book, then?" "Yes, sir, I have." "The fact that his father was a fascist all those years ago is hardly his fault. We don't visit the sins of the father on the children, unless you have anything else to tell me, Brigadier." There was a strange, set look on his face, as if he was somehow challenging Ferguson. Carter glanced at Ferguson, puzzled, his face pale, and Ferguson said firmly, "No, Prime Minister." "Good. Now we come to the Windsor Protocol. The effect on the royal family would be catastrophic, and I don't want that," the Prime Minister said. "You've brought the original of Freeman's diary, as I asked, and the translations. Are these all the copies?" "Everything," Ferguson assured him. "Good." The Prime Minister piled the documents together, got up, and went to the fire. He put the Windsor Protocol on top of the blazing coals first. An old story, gentlemen. The protocol flared, curled into ash. He followed it with the Hitler Order, the bank lists, the Blue Book, and finally Paul Freeman's diary. He turned. "It never happened, gentlemen. Not any of it." Carter stood up and managed a feeble smile. "A wise decision, Prime Minister." Prime Minister came around the desk to shake hands and smiled. "Now you must excuse me." In the hall, the porter helped them on with their coats. "A satisfactory conclusion all round, I'd say," Carter remarked. "You think so, do you?" Ferguson said. The porter opened the door, and at that moment an aide hurried in. "A moment, gentlemen. We've just had a most distressing call from the river police. They recovered the body of Sir Francis Paymer from the Thames a short time ago." Carter was struck dumb, and Ferguson said, "Very sad. Thank you for letting us know." And he stepped out and put up his umbrella and started to walk along Downing Street. Carter caught up with him and grabbed his arm. "What was it you said to him, Ferguson?" "I gave him all the facts," Ferguson said. "You are aware of the part he played from the beginning of this affair. I can only imagine he decided to do the decent thing." "Very convenient." "Yes, isn't it?" They were on the pavement of Whitehall now. "Do you want to share a cab?" "Damn you to hell, Ferguson," Simon Carter told him, and walked away. A black cab swerved into the curb. Ferguson climbed in, and the cab pulled away. Dillon removed his cap and smiled at Ferguson in the rearview mirror. "How did it go?" Ferguson said, "Did you steal this thing?" "No, it belongs to a good friend of mine. Now, what about the Prime Minister?" "He put everything on the fire, said it was an old story, was even charitable about Francis Paymer." "Did you put him straight there?" "I couldn't see the point." "And how did Carter take it?" "Rather badly. They recovered Paymer's body." "And Carter thinks Paymer did it because of pressure from you?" "I don't know what he thinks or care. The only thing I worry about is Carter's competence. He dislikes me so much that it clouded his judgment. For example, he was so taken up with the mention of Sir Joseph Paymer in the Blue Book on page 18 that he missed the gentleman on page 51. "And who would that be?" "An army sergeant from the First World War who entered politics and became General Secretary of a major trade union. He died about 10 years ago. And who are we talking about? The Prime Minister's uncle on his father's side. Mother of God, said Dillon. And you think he knew, the Prime Minister, I mean? That I knew? Oh, yes, Ferguson nodded. Very convenient, I must say, Dillon observed. No, the Prime Minister was right. We can't visit the sins of the fathers on the children. Paymer was different. Where are we going, by the way? Your place, I suppose. Ferguson opened the window a little and let the rain blow in. I've been thinking, Dillon. My department's under severe pressure at the moment. We've got the Yugoslavian business and all this neo-Nazi stuff in Berlin and East Germany. Losing Jack Lane leaves me in rather a hole. I see. Ferguson leaned forward. Right up your street. Think about it. Dillon swung the wheel, did a U-turn, and started back the other way. Ferguson was flung back in his seat. What are you doing, for God's sake? Dillon smiled in the rear-view mirror. You did mention dinner at the Garrick Club, didn't you?